In March of 1974, a 26-year-old man forced Princess Anne's car to a stop 200 yards from Buckingham Palace, carrying 2 loaded pistols and a typed ransom note that read, in part, "Anne will be shot dead." He shot her bodyguard, he shot her chauffeur, he shot a journalist who ran over to help. Then he put his head inside the car and told her to get out. She looked at him and said, "Not bloody likely." 4 months into her marriage, and the royal family had already come within one jammed pistol trigger of losing her to a man demanding £3 million in 20 unlocked suitcases. That's not even the worst thing that happened to this family. It's just the first thing. 11 years later, a woman in New Zealand gave birth to a daughter whose father was paying her rent under a fake job title, equestrian consultant, specifically to keep his own wife from ever finding out the child existed. The father was Anne's husband. The wife was Anne. It took 6 years, a threat from his own agent, and a court-ordered paternity test before the truth became impossible to keep hidden. A decade after that, Buckingham Palace issued a formal statement calling one of its own grandchildren's decisions a serious error of judgment because he'd secretly sold photographs from his own wedding, the one the Queen personally attended, to a magazine for £500,000 without telling a single other member of his family it was happening. And in 2020, while the world was watching Harry and Meghan walk away from the monarchy, almost nobody noticed that the Queen's own grandson had just appeared in a Chinese milk commercial, on camera, captioned, "British royal family member Peter Phillips, selling dairy to a country he'd probably struggle to point to on a map." 4 different decades. 4 completely different scandals. One family, sitting at the very edge of the royal bloodline, generating chaos precisely because nobody thought they needed watching closely enough to stop it. This is the story of the Phillips family, the branch of the House of Windsor that got no title, no crown, and almost no protection from the consequences of its own decisions. Which is exactly why, for 50 years, they've been the one part of this family the palace could never fully control. We start with the wedding nobody thought would matter. Westminster Abbey, 1973. 500 million people watching a fairy tale that was already, quietly, coming apart before the ink on the marriage certificate had dried. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Princess Anne met Mark Phillips in 1968 at a party held after that year's Olympic equestrian trials. She was 17. He was a 19-year-old army cadet with a genuine gift for eventing, one that would carry him to an Olympic gold medal at the Munich Games 4 years later. Horses were the actual language between them. Anne rode competitively at international level herself, well enough that the BBC named her Sports Personality of the Year in 1971, the only royal ever to win that award on athletic merit alone. For the next 5 years, the relationship stayed almost entirely out of the press. That fact alone is worth sitting with, because it never happened again for either of them. Everything that followed, for the rest of both their lives, happened in public. Before Phillips, Anne had been seeing Andrew Parker Bowles, the future first husband of Camilla, a name that would go on to thread through 3 of the monarchy's defining scandals over the following 4 decades. Parker Bowles was Catholic. Under the rules governing the family at the time, marrying him would have cost Anne her place in the line of succession, since the sovereign must remain in communion with the Church of England. The relationship didn't sour, it simply hit a wall neither of them could move. Parker Bowles married Camilla Shand in 1973. The same year Anne married Phillips. 2 weddings, 4 months apart, both drawn from the same tight equestrian social circle, the same country houses, the same horse trials, the same handful of overlapping friends. Nobody at the time connected them. In hindsight, that circle would go on to produce most of the monarchy's defining private scandals for the next 30 years. The wedding took place on the 14th of November, 1973, at Westminster Abbey, staged as pure spectacle. 2,000 guests filled the Abbey. It was the first royal wedding broadcast live via satellite to a genuinely global audience, and American networks covered it as though it were a moon landing, not an unreasonable comparison given that live satellite broadcasting was still a novelty only 4 years after Apollo 11. The New York Times ran a review the next morning, complaining that all the pageantry left the average viewer puzzled and blinking, which is a very 1973 way of saying the wedding looked gorgeous and explained nothing about the two people actually getting married. What almost nobody reported, because almost nobody outside the family's own circle knew yet, was what kind of marriage this actually was, underneath the ceremony. Phillips came from a comfortably well-off but entirely untitled family. His father ran a company that manufactured agricultural machinery in Wiltshire. He had no inherited land, no aristocratic lineage, no experience whatsoever with the specific pressures of royal life beyond 5 years of quietly dating a princess. What he did have was a competitive intensity that matched Anne's almost exactly, and for the first several years of the marriage, that shared drive read publicly as a partnership between equals. Two internationally competitive riders, both consumed by the same demanding sport, training horses side by side through long seasons at a working farm. By the standards of royal marriages, it was an unusually plausible love story. Two people who genuinely liked the same thing, for the same reasons. The house itself deserves a moment here, because almost everything covered in this documentary eventually happens on that one piece of land. Gatcombe Park cost the Queen a reported £750,000 when she bought it in 1976, 3 years into the marriage. Once the couple had decided their original residence near Sandhurst no longer suited them, Gatcombe became, over the following 5 decades, the setting for nearly every subsequent chapter of this family's story. This is where the marriage starts fraying, quietly, behind a working stable block. This is where the divorce eventually gets negotiated, while both parties still technically live within the same boundary. This is where Anne's second husband moves in, and where Mark Phillips, remarkably, stays on for years afterward in a separate house on the grounds. And it's where, decades later, both of Anne's adult children build their own homes, raising their own kids a short walk from where their parents' marriage first started coming apart. By 1977, 4 years into the marriage, Anne gave birth to Peter Phillips. He became the first legitimate grandchild of a reigning British monarch in more than 500 years to be born without a title of any kind. That decision came directly from Anne, not from palace protocol, and a later part of this documentary unpacks exactly why she made it and what it ended up buying both her children as adults. At the time, none of that calculation registered against the sheer ceremony surrounding the birth itself. A 41-gun salute was fired from the Tower of London. The Archbishop of Canterbury personally baptized the infant in the music room of Buckingham Palace, with Anne's brother Prince Charles standing as one of the godparents. Zara followed 2 years later, in 1981, under the same quiet arrangement, enormous fanfare around the birth, and a title deliberately withheld underneath all of it. On the surface, every formal marker of dynastic success was present and accounted for. Underneath it, something had already gone wrong, and it had gone wrong early enough and violently enough that by the time Peter was 3 years old, both his parents had already lived through an attempt on his mother's life. It happened 4 months into the marriage, on the evening of the 20th of March, 1974, on the Mall, roughly 200 yards from the palace gates. Anne and Phillips were being driven home from a charity film screening in a maroon Austin Princess limousine, with Anne's lady-in-waiting, Rowena Brassey, seated across from them, and a single Scotland Yard bodyguard, Inspector James Beaton, riding in front. A white Ford Escort forced their driver to stop. A man got out holding 2 handguns. His name was Ian Ball. He was 26, unemployed, and had spent close to 3 years planning the attack. He had rented a house near Sandhurst, close to where Anne and Phillips had previously lived, hired a typewriter specifically to compose a ransom note, and purchased both weapons and 2 pairs of handcuffs in advance. The note itself, later recovered by police, demanded a ransom of somewhere between £2 and £3 million to be paid entirely in £5 notes, packed into 20 unlocked suitcases, and flown to Switzerland on a plane the Queen herself was instructed to board in person, so she could personally verify her own signature on the paperwork. One line of the note read simply, "Anne will be shot dead." Ball would later claim after his arrest that the entire ransom was intended for the National Health Service to fund psychiatric treatment. Beaton stepped out of the car first, assuming this was an aggressive, disgruntled driver rather than an armed assailant. Ball shot him almost immediately. The bullet caught Beaton's shoulder, and his own service pistol jammed the moment he tried to return fire, leaving him effectively unarmed in the middle of the assault. Ball then wrenched open the rear door of the limousine and grabbed Anne by the arm, while Phillips held onto her from the other side, both of them fighting to keep her inside the car against a man who had already fired twice. "Please, come out," Ball reportedly told her. "You've got to come." Anne's answer, confirmed afterward by multiple witnesses and repeated in nearly every British newspaper the following morning, was two words: "Not bloody likely." She didn't move. She later said, in an interview given decades afterward, that she had briefly considered hitting Ball herself before deciding it was smarter to simply try to get away. Ball shot the royal chauffeur, Alexander Callender, in the chest. He shot Beaton twice more, forcing him out of the car entirely and onto the pavement. A police constable, Michael Hills, arrived moments later and was shot in the stomach for his trouble. A tabloid reporter named Brian McConnell, who happened to be nearby and ran over to help, was also shot down before he could reach the car. It was only when a passing pedestrian, a former boxer named Ronnie Russell, ran directly at Ball and punched him in the head that the assault finally broke apart, giving Anne and her lady-in-waiting the chance to climb out the opposite door. Ball fled on foot into St. James's Park, where a plainclothes detective tackled him from behind and made the arrest. 5 people were shot within a few minutes on a public London street, in direct sight of the palace gates, over an attempt to kidnap a princess 4 months into her first marriage. Beaton and Russell were later awarded the George Cross and George Medal, the 2 highest British honours available for civilian and non-combat bravery. When the Queen personally presented Russell with his medal, she reportedly told him, "The medal is from the Queen, but I want to thank you as Anne's mother, about as close as Elizabeth II ever came, in any recorded public setting, to speaking as a parent rather than as a reigning sovereign." Ball himself was found, after arrest, to be suffering from schizophrenia. He was committed to Broadmoor, the high-security psychiatric hospital, where he would remain for the next 41 years, a period broken only briefly by a hunger strike in 2002. Every person he shot that night survived, and fully recovered from their injuries. The security failures the attack exposed were almost as alarming as the attack itself. Beaton later admitted that on the night of the shooting, he had been the only protection officer assigned to the couple, with no backup vehicle and, in his own words, essentially no training for a scenario like this one. "I had nothing," he said in an interview decades later. "The training was non-existent, but then again, nothing was going to happen." That single officer arrangement was, remarkably, the same protocol used at the time, even for the Queen's own unofficial movements. It changed within weeks. Protection details were doubled at minimum, service weapons were upgraded, and the entire structural approach to close royal protection was rebuilt from scratch. For Anne and Phillips personally, the incident should have been the kind of shared trauma that either cements a young marriage or exposes exactly how little was holding it together beneath the surface. It did both, just not at the same time. In the immediate aftermath, the couple presented publicly as steady and unshaken, and the country largely read the episode as proof of Anne's now famous composure under pressure, the same dry toughness that would define her public image for the next 50 years. 2 words, delivered calmly to a man holding a loaded gun, became a kind of national shorthand for exactly who she was. What the incident didn't do, and what nothing over the following decade managed to do either, was slow the much quieter deterioration already underway inside the marriage itself. Phillips, for all his genuine talent on a horse, reportedly struggled with the specific psychological weight of being married into an institution rather than simply married to a person. The total loss of privacy, the permanent presence of protection officers a few feet away at all times, the sense of playing a supporting role in someone else's constitutional life rather than the lead in his own. Those pressures don't register in a 41-gun salute or a broadcast watched by 500 million people. They show up later, in small private decisions made when nobody outside the household is paying attention, and by the early 1980s, several of those decisions had already begun pointing the marriage toward the version of itself the tabloids would spend the rest of that decade trying to fully document. That's where the next part of this story picks up. Not another single dramatic night on a London street, but the years of slower unraveling that followed the bullets. The years that would eventually produce an affair with the very officer sent to protect the family's safety, and a second child that Mark Phillips would spend the better part of 4 decades refusing to publicly acknowledge as his own. By the end of the 1970s, Princess Anne and Mark Phillips had built exactly the public image both of them wanted people to see. 2 Olympic-level riders, a working farm at Gatcombe Park, 2 young children, a marriage that looked, from a comfortable distance, like it ran on shared discipline rather than romance, which for a royal couple of that particular era counted as a genuinely reassuring image to project. That surface held for most of a decade. What it concealed, according to multiple biographical accounts published years afterward, once people closer to the family finally started talking openly, was a household where Phillips was frequently away on equestrian business for weeks at a stretch, where Anne was left managing both young children and an entire working estate largely on her own, and where the 2 of them had drifted, without any single dramatic rupture, into a domestic routine that had very little left in it beyond shared logistics and scheduling. Into that specific gap walked a Scotland Yard officer named Peter Cross. Cross was assigned to protect Anne at Gatcombe Park starting in 1979, 5 years after the mall shooting had permanently changed how close protection worked around the entire family. His job, in the most literal sense, was to keep her physically safe. What he later admitted to, in interviews given openly after leaving Royal Protection Service, was an affair with her that he said began in August of 1980, 6 years after the shooting that had brought his entire profession's revised protocols into existence in the first place. She made all the running in our friendship, Cross said publicly, years later, describing how the relationship actually developed. According to his own account, it grew gradually out of long, late-night conversations during the stretches when Phillips was traveling for competitions, at a point when Anne, by Cross's own telling, felt genuinely isolated inside a marriage that had already quietly stopped functioning as a partnership in any meaningful day-to-day sense. Both parties were married to other people when the affair reportedly began. Cross's own then-wife, a woman named Linda, later gave interviews of her own about it, describing her husband candidly as someone women were consistently drawn to, and who, in her own words, struggled to resist that kind of attention when it was offered to him. None of this became public knowledge in real time. It stayed contained within a small circle for years, known only to those directly involved and a handful of close observers, until Cross eventually left royal protection duty and the story began surfacing in the British press, piece by piece, over the course of the 1980s. By the time it did surface in any detail, it wasn't treated by the press as an isolated incident. It was treated as confirmation of something the tabloids had already been circling for years without quite being able to prove, that the marriage sold to 500 million television viewers in 1973 had, within its very first decade, quietly become something closer to 2 separate lives that simply happened to share the same address and the same last name. Phillips himself was not, by any account, a passive party in all of this. Reporting from the period, including detailed accounts later published in Harper's Bazaar, described what was characterized at the time as a series of semi-public affairs on his own side of the marriage, including a documented relationship with Pamela Bordes, a woman reported at the time to be working as a call girl, alongside a separate relationship with a Canadian public relations executive, and yet another with a British television anchorwoman. Anne, in the same body of reporting, was linked romantically to the actor Anthony Andrews during roughly the same window. None of these particular allegations were ever confirmed with the same documentary certainty that would later attach itself specifically to the Cross affair, or to what Phillips did in New Zealand a few years later, which the next part of this documentary covers in full. But the sheer volume and consistency of the reporting, coming from multiple separate outlets over multiple years, made it fairly clear that whatever was actually happening at Gatcombe Park by the early 1980s bore almost no resemblance to the wedding photographs taken outside Westminster Abbey less than a decade earlier. What makes the Cross situation meaningfully different from the rest of this surrounding speculation is that it eventually got confirmed in specific and personal detail, by the man at the center of it himself. He wasn't a tabloid source protected by careful anonymity, the way so much of the reporting around this marriage tended to be structured. He gave his account under his own name, describing specific conversations, specific moods, specific stretches of time when he said the relationship was at its most emotionally serious. That level of named, personal specificity is part of why the story kept resurfacing in royal retrospectives for decades afterward, eventually being revisited and dramatized in the Netflix series The Crown, which brought a fictionalized version of the affair to a global streaming audience nearly 40 years after it had actually happened. For Anne personally, the relevant context here isn't really Peter Cross as an individual or the specific details of what he did or didn't feel. It's what his sustained presence in her private life says about the actual condition of the marriage he stepped into. A princess who, by her own bodyguard's later account, felt isolated enough inside her own household to begin a sustained affair with the very man assigned to guard her front door, is not a princess living inside a functioning marriage in any real sense. And 1980, the year Cross says the affair began, was only 7 years into that marriage, with both of Anne's children still under the age of 4. Whatever visible cracks the public would eventually see documented in detail during the divorce proceedings of the early 1990s had, in other words, already opened in private a full decade earlier, quietly. Behind a facade the royal press office worked hard to keep intact. There's a second thread running through this same period that deserves direct attention because it involves a structural failure in the same institution that had already failed so visibly and violently on the night of the mall shooting, the design of royal protection itself. The job of a close protection officer requires being physically present with a principal at nearly all times, across the most private, unguarded, and emotionally exposed moments of that person's daily life. That level of enforced proximity is precisely what makes any given officer uniquely positioned to become emotionally significant to the person they've been assigned to protect, particularly in situations where that person's actual spouse is frequently absent for long stretches. This isn't a coincidence unique to Anne's specific circumstances. Similar dynamics involving royal protection officers and the family members they were assigned to guard would go on to surface again in later decades, involving other members of the extended royal family, and Scotland Yard's own internal reviews over the years have periodically flagged the emotional proximity built structurally into the job itself as a genuine institutional risk, rather than treating each occurrence as an isolated scandal. Anne's situation with Cross wasn't some strange aberration in how royal protection was supposed to function. It was, in a very real sense, exactly the kind of outcome the job's basic structure makes considerably more likely than official palace accounts of these incidents have ever tended to acknowledge publicly. None of this reached the general public in any detail during the early 1980s themselves. What the public actually received throughout that period was the carefully maintained version of the marriage built specifically for cameras, joint appearances at major horse trials, formal portrait sittings, the occasional magazine interview in which both Anne and Phillips spoke warmly about their shared commitment to eventing and to raising Peter and Zara together at Gatcombe. The gap between that public performance and what was quietly happening inside the actual marriage is, in miniature, the exact same gap this entire documentary keeps returning to across every single member of this extended family, generation after generation. A carefully maintained public surface and a private reality running underneath it on an entirely different set of facts that would take years to fully surface. By the middle of the 1980s, that widening gap had grown to the point where it could no longer be maintained through quiet discretion alone. Mark Phillips had, by this point, begun a relationship of his own that would go on to produce a child outside the marriage entirely. Not a vague rumor or a tabloid allegation built on anonymous sourcing, but a documented fact he would eventually be legally forced to confirm through a court-ordered paternity test years later. That relationship, and the daughter it produced, is where this story goes next, because it becomes the single event that finally turned years of accumulated private tension into a full public reckoning that nobody left in the family could contain any longer. no matter how carefully they had managed everything up to that point. Her name, at the time the story eventually broke into the open, was Felicity Tonkin. Her mother was a New Zealand art teacher named Heather Tonkin, and the specific way Mark Phillips chose to handle the news of her existence over the better part of the following decade tells you almost everything you need to understand about the real difference between how this family managed scandal quietly in private and how completely that same management style collapsed the moment it was finally forced out into public view. Mark Phillips met Heather Tonkin at a riding clinic in Auckland sometime in the early 1980s, while he was still married to Princess Anne and living, at least officially and on paper, at Gatcombe Park with his wife and 2 young children. Tonkin was a New Zealand art teacher and a competitive equestrian in her own right, entirely consistent with the pattern that ran through almost every significant relationship Phillips had, before this one and after it. Every woman he was seriously connected to across his entire adult life, going back to Anne herself, seems to have come from inside the same specific world of horses and competitive riding that had first brought him into royal circles back in 1968. The affair itself, according to accounts that later surfaced in detail in the British press, was reportedly brief, and one particular detail from it became a small, grim piece of tabloid folklore that got repeated for years afterward. Phillips is said to have left his own riding boots outside the hotel room door, specifically so Tonkin could find the right room in an unfamiliar hotel. It's a strange, almost domestic detail to survive in the historical record surrounding a royal scandal, but it did survive, repeated in outlet after outlet whenever this story got retold over the following decades, largely because it captured something true about the sheer carelessness running through the entire episode from the very start. This wasn't a man being cautious or discreet or even mildly careful about being caught. Felicity Tonkin was born in 1985. She would grow up just 4 years younger than her royal half-sister Zara, on the opposite side of the world, with no public knowledge on Zara's part, for years, that this half-sister even existed. What happened next is where this particular story stops being a private matter strictly between 2 consenting adults and becomes something closer to a documented, sustained pattern of behavior stretching across the better part of a decade. According to reporting in the Daily Mail and multiple subsequent accounts published afterward, Phillips allegedly pressured Heather Tonkin to have an abortion once he learned she was pregnant. She refused outright. After Felicity was born, Phillips began making regular payments to Tonkin, reported at roughly $7,500 a year, funneled deliberately through an associate rather than paid directly, and officially logged, according to his own later accounts, as compensation for what was formally described as equestrian consultancy, work Tonkin was never actually performing. He explicitly did not want to be named on the birth certificate. For years, true to that wish, he wasn't. That specific arrangement held for roughly 6 years, largely out of any public view whatsoever, until 1991, when the payments started slowing noticeably and eventually stalled out completely. At that point, Heather Tonkin went to the press directly. Her stated goal, in her own words at the time, was straightforward and specific. She wanted Phillips to publicly and formally acknowledge his daughter's existence and to establish a proper, legally binding financial settlement for her ongoing support, rather than continue with an informal arrangement he could quietly abandon whenever it suited him. "I am doing what I am doing for my child," she told reporters directly in 1991. "I hope and pray Mark will do the right thing and make a proper and legally binding settlement on her. I wish I could wake up one morning in the knowledge that the record had been put straight and I don't have to worry anymore." Before she went public with the story, according to later reporting on the episode, Phillips's own agent, a man named John Erskine, allegedly told Tonkin directly and explicitly that he would make life a bloody misery for her if she pursued going to the press. She went ahead with it, regardless of that threat. A court-ordered paternity test conducted in 1991 confirmed, with full legal certainty, exactly what the equestrian consultancy payments had already quietly acknowledged for 6 years, without ever saying so directly. Mark Phillips was Felicity's biological father. By this point in the timeline, he had been married to Princess Anne for 18 years, had fathered this second child while still officially living at Gatcombe Park with his wife and their 2 children, and had spent 6 full years actively disguising ongoing child support payments as a legitimate business expense rather than admit, to his own wife, his own children, or the wider public, that a second daughter existed anywhere in the world. For Princess Anne, the confirmation landed at a moment when the marriage had already been quietly fraying for the better part of a decade, through the Peter Cross affair and years of exactly the kind of separate lives arrangement described in the previous part of this documentary. But a court-confirmed paternity test represents a fundamentally different order of evidence than rumor or tabloid speculation built around unnamed sources describing semi-public affairs. It is a fact, dated and legally established beyond any possible dispute, that cannot be managed away through discretion, denial, or careful public relations, the way earlier speculation had been. According to reporting from People magazine published at the time, the Tonkin confirmation gave Anne exactly the justification she had apparently been waiting for, to formally and permanently end the marriage. This is all the excuse she needed to get Mark out of Gatcombe, a source close to the family told the magazine. Mark has had it. Anne's hand will be strengthened significantly. She filed for divorce not long afterward. It was finalized in 1992, and Phillips, who had been living at Gatcombe Park for nearly 2 full decades by that point, was asked to leave the property that had served as the family's primary home since 1976. The estate itself stayed with Anne in the settlement. It remains, to this day, more than 3 decades later, the geographic home base for the entire extended Phillips family, including the adult children of the very marriage he was ultimately removed from. Felicity Tonkin's own life afterward followed a pattern that recurs, almost eerily consistently, throughout this family's broader story across multiple generations. Whatever chaos existed at the level of the parents involved, the actual children caught in the middle of it tended to build ordinary, largely private, and generally stable adult lives once they were old enough to do so entirely on their own terms, away from the specific scandal that had marked their birth. She is now known professionally as Felicity Wade, works as an equine veterinarian in New Zealand, and had a son with her husband in 2017. A local resident in her small community, quoted years later by the Daily Mail, described her and her family plainly and without any particular drama. "There's nothing fancy about them at all." According to multiple accounts published over the following decades, Mark Phillips never fully accepted her or built any substantial ongoing relationship with her as she grew into adulthood. Reports as recent as the past several years continue to describe him as still declining to publicly acknowledge her as his daughter in any meaningful, ongoing way, despite the paternity test itself having settled the underlying biological question more than 30 years ago at this point. There's a specific and particular kind of embarrassment buried inside this story that's worth naming directly and clearly, because it's meaningfully different from a conventional royal infidelity scandal of the kind the tabloids had already been circling for years by this point. This wasn't simply a case of a man cheating on a princess, which by itself would have been unremarkable within the broader pattern this documentary has already traced. It was a man who fathered a child outside his marriage, disguised the resulting support payments as a legitimate business expense for 6 consecutive years, allowed an explicit threat to be made against the child's own mother, specifically to keep her quiet and cooperative, and then, once fully exposed by a court-ordered legal test he could no longer contest or deny, largely declined to build any meaningful relationship with that same child for the remainder of his life. Compare that pattern of behavior directly to how this same family would later handle the decision to withhold titles from Peter and Zara, a choice made openly, discussed candidly in interviews over the years, and defended publicly as a deliberate effort to give both children the most ordinary lives possible under difficult circumstances. The Tonkin situation was, in almost every meaningful respect, the exact mirror image of that particular instinct. Not a family protecting a child from excessive and unwanted scrutiny, but a father actively managing a child's very existence as a liability to be minimized and concealed for as long as humanly possible. By 1992, the specific year the divorce was finally finalized, 3 of the Queen's 4 children had seen their own marriages collapse within the same 12-month period, a run of accumulated bad luck, significant enough that Elizabeth II herself gave that entire year its own now famous Latin nickname during a public speech at Guildhall. annus horribilis, her horrible year. Anne and Phillips's divorce was one of those three collapses, alongside the very public breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage and the formal separation of Andrew and Sarah Ferguson. Of the three, Anne's ended by far the fastest, and relatively speaking, the quietest of the group. She remarried within the year. Phillips, by contrast, did not remarry until 1997, to a dressage rider named Sandy Pfluger, with whom he had another daughter, Stephanie, born that same year. That particular marriage lasted until 2012, when it was reported that Phillips had left Pfluger for a much younger woman named Lauren Huff, 32 years his junior at the time. What all of this adds up to, by the point Anne finally walked away from the marriage in 1992, is a clear and consistent pattern that would go on to define Mark Phillips's public reputation for the rest of his life, far more thoroughly than his Olympic gold medal ever did. A serial, repeated pattern of relationships conducted alongside his existing marriages, at least one of them producing a child he spent years actively refusing to acknowledge, and a general public image, once the full record eventually came out into the open, of a man far less interested in the genuine responsibilities of the institution he had married into than in the personal access and lifestyle it quietly provided him for 2 full decades. Anne, for her own part, had already met the man she would go on to spend the rest of her life with by the time the Tonkin story first broke publicly in 1991. He was a Royal Navy officer, serving in a role that put him in close, sustained daily contact with the royal family, in a position not entirely unlike the one Peter Cross had occupied a decade earlier, under very different circumstances. His name was Timothy Lawrence, and the specific way their relationship became public, back in 1989, 3 full years before Anne's divorce was even formally finalized, is its own small, but genuinely revealing scandal, built around a set of intercepted personal letters that nearly derailed Anne's second chance at a stable marriage before it had properly even begun. Timothy Lawrence entered Princess Anne's life in a role that looked, on paper, nothing like Peter Cross's had. He wasn't a protection officer assigned to guard her body. He was a Royal Navy officer serving as equerry to the Queen, a job that put him inside the family's daily routine in a way few outsiders ever experience. An equerry is part secretary, part personal attendant. He eats meals with the family, accompanies them on outings, cruises with them aboard the royal yacht, and makes the formal introductions whenever important guests arrive. It's a role built entirely around proximity, and Lawrence held it from 1986 to 1989. Before any of that, Lawrence had spent over a decade building a genuinely serious naval career that had nothing to do with the royal family at all. Born on the 1st of March 1955 in Camberwell, South London, the younger son of a Royal Navy commander who later worked as a marine engine salesman, he was commissioned as a midshipman in 1973 on a naval scholarship, studied geography at Durham University, and trained at the Britannia Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, before serving as a navigating officer aboard the Royal Yacht Britannia and later HMS Sheffield. He made lieutenant 10 months ahead of schedule in 1977, was mentioned in dispatches in 1983 for service during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and was promoted to lieutenant commander in 1985, a year before he was assigned to the Queen as equerry. By the time he took up that post, he wasn't a courtier angling for royal proximity. He was a rising naval officer, temporarily seconded to a ceremonial job, the same as dozens of officers before him. Almost none of the others ended up marrying into the family. The relationship became public knowledge in 1989, in a manner neither Lawrence nor Anne had chosen for themselves. A set of personal letters he had written to her were stolen and made their way to The Sun, which published news of their existence without naming the sender. Buckingham Palace's official statement is worth reading closely because of how carefully it was worded. The stolen letters were addressed to the Princess Royal by Commander Timothy Lawrence, the Queen's equerry. We have nothing to say about the contents of personal letters sent to Her Royal Highness by a friend, which were stolen, and which are the subject of a police investigation. Notice exactly what the palace chose to confirm, and what it chose to withhold. It confirmed his name and his job title. It called him a friend. It said nothing whatsoever about the actual nature of the relationship, and it deliberately framed the entire episode around the theft rather than the affair. a distinction the palace clearly wanted the public to sit with rather than resolve. The theft itself was never solved in any way that produced further headlines, and the letters were never published in full. What the episode confirmed, without the palace ever officially confirming it, was that Anne's marriage to Mark Phillips had been effectively over for years by 1989, a full 3 years before the divorce was legally finalized. Lawrence, notably, was never accused publicly of anything resembling what would surface 2 years later in the Tonkin case. Nobody claimed he pressured anyone into anything, hid payments, or threatened a mother into silence. The entire scandal, to whatever extent it really was one, belonged far more to whoever stole the letters than to either of the two people who wrote and received them. Anne and Phillips's divorce was finalized in 1992. She married Lawrence that same year, on the 12th of December, in a Church of Scotland ceremony at Crathy Kirk near Balmoral, a venue chosen specifically because the Church of Scotland, unlike the Church of England, permits the remarriage of divorcees. There was no satellite broadcast, no Westminster Abbey, no audience of 500 million people. Lawrence received no peerage upon marrying into the family, a detail that stands out sharply set against how titles had been handled elsewhere in this same story. He remained, at the ceremony and for years afterward, simply Commander Lawrence, later Captain, later Vice Admiral, entirely on the strength of his own naval promotions, rather than anything conferred through marriage. What happened to his career after the wedding is its own quietly revealing footnote. He didn't retire from the Navy to become a full-time royal consort. He kept serving, commanding 4 separate warships over the following years, including the frigate HMS Cumberland, and leading a squadron of 5 frigates on deployment to the South Atlantic in 1996. He didn't retire from the Royal Navy entirely until 2010, at the rank of Vice Admiral, having built a career that would have been fully respectable and largely unremarkable to the wider public, even if he had never met Anne at all. Afterward, he moved into heritage and infrastructure work, chairing English Heritage, sitting on the Defence Estates Board, later serving as a commissioner for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. In 2011, the Queen made him a Knight Commander of the Royal Victorian Order. In August of 2025, King Charles III advanced him further, to Knight Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order, one of the highest honours a sovereign can personally bestow, placing him in the same tier as senior working royals like Queen Camilla. None of that reads like scandal. It reads like the opposite, a man who built an entire independent professional identity before, during, and after marrying into the institution, and who was rewarded steadily over 3 decades for competent, low-drama service rather than for mere proximity to the crown. Lawrence and Anne have no children together. They have, by every available account, built the quietest and least eventful marriage covered anywhere in this documentary, one that has now outlasted her first marriage by more than a decade and has produced, in over 30 years, not a single new headline of the kind that fills the rest of this story. That contrast tells you something genuinely important about what Anne actually wanted the second time she got married, compared to what had been constructed for her the first time around. The 1973 wedding was built as pure spectacle, designed to project a fairy tale to a global audience that had almost no real connection to what was actually happening between the two people standing at the altar. The 1992 wedding was built to avoid exactly that kind of attention entirely. A small venue, minimal press, a groom holding no title of his own, and already the subject of one previous scandal involving stolen private correspondence. It reads, in hindsight, less like a woman trying to recapture some version of the original fairy tale, and considerably more like a woman who had already learned, at real personal cost, exactly what that fairy tale had cost her the first time she agreed to live inside one. Mark Phillips, meanwhile, remained connected to the extended family in a way that genuinely surprised royal watchers at the time, and one that continues to surprise people revisiting this story with fresh eyes today. Rather than being fully cut out of Anne's life or his children's lives following the divorce, he stayed on at the Gatcombe Park estate itself, in a separate property on the grounds called Aston Farm. Reports from the period consistently describe him as continuing to actively coach Zara in eventing well into her competitive career, appearing personally at her competitions alongside Anne, and by most surviving accounts, maintaining what one source close to the family described plainly as a genuinely cordial working relationship with his ex-wife, despite everything that had already happened between them. He was, for years afterward, described as living at Aston Farm with his second wife, Sandy Pfluger, and their daughter Stephanie, all of them situated on precisely the same estate where Anne and Timothy Lawrence lived as well, just a short distance away. 3 entirely separate households, forming one extended and genuinely complicated family, all sharing the same few hundred acres of Gloucestershire farmland the Queen had originally purchased as a wedding present 2 decades earlier. That arrangement, arguably more than almost anything else covered in this documentary, captures the specific and distinctive way this family chose to handle its own internal dysfunction over time. Not estrangement, not a clean, total break between the parties involved. Instead, a kind of enforced, geographically compressed civility, where an ex-husband who had fathered a child entirely outside the marriage and been formally asked to leave the main house, nonetheless remained close enough, both physically and personally, to coach his own daughter's competitive riding career and continue showing up at the same family gatherings for years afterward, without apparent friction. Whether that ongoing arrangement reflects genuine forgiveness on Anne's part, simple practical convenience for 2 people who still shared children, and a serious professional interest in the same demanding sport, or the particular British upper-class instinct to keep unpleasantness quietly contained, rather than allowed to become dramatized in public, is something royal biographers still disagree on even now. What isn't seriously in dispute, looking at the historical record, is that it worked, in the narrow but meaningful sense that it kept the extended family functioning as a unit and largely out of sustained tabloid scrutiny for the better part of the following decade. The 2 children at the very center of all of this, Peter and Zara, grew up through their parents' divorce, through their own father's public paternity scandal, and through their mother's quiet second marriage, all while carrying no royal title of any kind whatsoever throughout their entire childhoods. That specific fact, touched on briefly in the opening part of this documentary, was not some accident of birth order, court protocol, or bureaucratic oversight. It was a deliberate decision Anne made, back in the mid-1970s, before either child had even been born, and it turned out, over the following 5 decades, to be the single most consequential choice she ever made regarding her children's future adult lives. It is also, once you look closely at exactly how and why that particular decision was actually made at the time, a far more calculated and forward-thinking piece of long-term royal strategy than she ever received meaningful public credit for at the time it was originally decided. When Peter Phillips was born in 1977, he became the first legitimate grandchild of a reigning British monarch in more than 500 years to arrive without any courtesy title attached to his name. That wasn't an oversight buried somewhere in the paperwork. It was a specific, deliberate request Anne made directly to the Queen before either of her children were even born, and by most royal biographers' accounts, it was overwhelmingly Anne's own decision rather than Phillips's, made for reasons that had almost nothing to do with modesty and almost everything to do with a fairly cold, clear-eyed read of exactly what a title would end up costing her children later in their adult lives, long after the ceremonial value of the thing had worn off. As the daughter of the sovereign rather than a son, Anne's own children fell outside the specific line of automatic titling that applied, under the conventions of the time, to the children of the monarch's sons rather than her daughters. Under the rules in place at the time, Peter and Zara could technically have been styled with courtesy titles through their grandfather Prince Philip, the exact same mechanism that made Prince Andrew's 2 daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, princesses in their own right. Anne specifically asked that this not happen for her own children. According to accounts given by royal commentators over the following decades, her reasoning was blunt and entirely practical. A title comes bundled with public duties, permanent public expectations, and guaranteed lifelong tabloid interest, none of which comes with any corresponding guarantee of income, personal security, or genuine institutional power to go along with it. What a title actually guarantees, in practice, is sustained scrutiny for life, regardless of whether the person wearing it ever asked for that job in the first place. Compare that directly to what happened, in the same decade, just one branch of the extended family over. Prince Andrew's daughters were given the formal title of princess. They grew up entirely inside the same relentless media apparatus that would eventually make their personal finances, their friendships, and in Beatrice's specific case, a single fascinator worn to someone else's royal wedding, into subjects of sustained national conversation for years at a stretch, often over genuinely trivial matters, inflated by a press machine that exists specifically to cover people carrying that title. Peter and Zara, by clear contrast, grew up as the Queen's own grandchildren, without any of that automatic public standing attached to their names. They could attend an entirely ordinary school, take entirely ordinary jobs, and largely walk down a street without being trailed by the exact same kind of relentless press attention that follows an actual working prince or princess. The practical, day-to-day consequences of this decision showed up almost immediately in how both children were raised, and continued showing up clearly throughout how both of their adult lives eventually unfolded. Peter attended the University of Exeter, an entirely ordinary university experience, carrying none of the institutional weight that would follow someone actually holding a title into higher education. He went on to build a career in the private sector, first with Jaguar Racing and later with Williams Formula One, before eventually founding his own sports management company, Sel Ook. None of that career path would have been remotely straightforward for an actual working prince to pursue, since a working royal's public duties and constitutional role tend to make an ordinary corporate job politically and practically awkward at best. Zara, meanwhile, built a genuinely elite career of her own in eventing, the exact same sport her father had competed in at Olympic level decades earlier, eventually becoming European and world champion in her own right, and going on to compete for Team GB at the London 2012 Olympics as part of Britain's silver medal-winning eventing team. She achieved that as a serious athlete first, and a member of the extended royal family only as a distant second consideration, in a way that would have been considerably more complicated for the palace to manage publicly had she been carrying the formal title of princess while doing it. Both siblings, once they reached adulthood, also did something neither of their more formally titled cousins could realistically do without triggering an immediate wave of public controversy. They took paid commercial work openly, without apology. Peter Phillips signed a series of brand endorsement deals over the following years, including work that would eventually produce one of the genuinely strangest moments covered anywhere in this documentary, which a later part covers in full. Zara similarly built out a substantial commercial career of her own around her sporting profile, endorsing brands connected to equestrianism and general fitness without facing anything like the backlash that has repeatedly greeted, for instance, Prince Andrew's various business dealings over the years, or the assorted commercial ventures other more formally titled royals have attempted and subsequently been forced to abandon under sustained public pressure. Because neither Peter nor Zara held any title at all, neither of them was bound by the same unwritten institutional rule, stating that working members of the royal family simply do not profit personally from their royal connections. They were, in the eyes of the public and the press alike, the Queen's grandchildren doing perfectly normal jobs, not princes and princesses moonlighting on the side as commercial pitchmen, and that distinction mattered enormously to how the public ultimately received and judged what each of them chose to do professionally. There's a genuinely important financial dimension to all of this worth naming plainly. Because Peter and Zara held no titles, they also received absolutely no funding whatsoever from the sovereign grant, the mechanism that finances the working members of the royal family and their official offices. Multiple outlets over the years, including the Daily Mail, have reported explicitly that Peter Phillips receives no direct money from the royal family at all, a detail that was specifically highlighted when his later commercial advertising work first came under public scrutiny. In practical, everyday terms, that means both siblings have had to build entirely self-funded adult lives from the ground up, which is precisely the underlying trade Anne appears to have been quietly making on their behalf back in the 1970s. Considerably less institutional status and ceremonial prestige, in direct exchange for the genuine freedom to actually earn a living without a palace press office weighing in on every decision they made. There's a further wrinkle to this story that rarely gets mentioned, and it involves the specific piece of constitutional law that made even Peter's own marriage briefly complicated a generation later, the Act of Settlement of 1701, which at the time still governed the entire line of succession and automatically stripped anyone in that line of their place the moment they married a Roman Catholic. Because Peter and Zara had been deliberately kept without titles, their positions in the line of succession were largely symbolic to begin with, several dozen places removed from any realistic prospect of the throne. And yet the law still technically applied to them in full, exactly as it applied to title heirs far closer to the crown, meaning that even a decision made in 1977 to keep 2 children out of the spotlight could not fully insulate them, 3 decades later, from a piece of legislation written under Queen Anne in the early 18th century. That law was eventually repealed by the Succession to the Crown Act of 2013, but not before it had already shaped one of the more overlooked footnotes in Peter Phillips's own wedding, covered in the next part of this documentary. Looking back at Anne's original decision now, more than 4 decades after it was first made, it reads as one of the more quietly shrewd pieces of long-term strategic thinking anyone in this entire family has managed to pull off. Anne herself has, over the years, given interviews touching on her own reasoning in fairly general terms, describing her genuine wish for her children to have as ordinary an upbringing as reasonably possible, given the unusual circumstances they were born into, through no choice of their own. What that particular framing tends to quietly undersell is just how much harder-edged and calculated the actual underlying decision looks in hindsight, once you trace its full consequences across 4 decades. A title is not, in any practical sense, a gift. It's a permanent set of institutional constraints wrapped carefully in ceremonial language, and Anne appears to have understood that specific distinction earlier, and considerably more clearly, than almost anyone else in her entire generation of the family. It did not, however, make either of her children immune to scandal in any absolute sense. It simply changed, in a fairly fundamental way, the specific kind of scandal each of them was actually capable of generating as adults. A prince who breaks with protocol becomes, almost automatically, a genuine constitutional headache for the entire institution. An untitled royal grandchild who breaks with protocol in a comparable way simply embarrasses himself in front of a somewhat smaller, though still very attentive audience, without the same institutional stakes attached to the outcome. Peter Phillips would go on, over the following years, to test the outer practical limits of exactly how much embarrassment an untitled royal grandchild could actually generate under this specific arrangement, starting with his own wedding in 2008, an event that managed to blindside his own grandmother, the reigning monarch herself, so thoroughly and so completely that Buckingham Palace ultimately felt compelled to issue a formal public statement addressing it directly. Peter Phillips met Autumn Kelly, a Canadian management consultant, at the 2003 Formula One Canadian Grand Prix in Montreal, where he was attending in his professional capacity through his job with Williams Racing at the time. Kelly, by her own later account of how they met, had no idea whatsoever that she was talking to the Queen's own grandson during their initial conversation. She only found out roughly 6 weeks into knowing him, purely by accident, after happening to see him appear on television one evening. She had grown up in Pointe Claire, in Montreal's English-speaking West Island, attended a Catholic high school there, studied East Asian studies at McGill University, and worked, at various points before meeting Phillips, as a bartender, a part-time model, and briefly as an actress, appearing in a small, non-speaking but formally credited role in a 1996 film called Rainbow. Their engagement was formally announced in July of 2007, and because Kelly had been raised within the Catholic Church, her marriage to Phillips required one specific procedural step that had nothing whatsoever to do with romance and everything to do with the same piece of centuries-old constitutional law introduced in the previous part of this documentary. Under the Act of Settlement of 1701, still in force at the time of their engagement, a member of the line of succession who married a Roman Catholic would automatically and immediately lose their place in that line entirely, with no exceptions granted, regardless of how far removed from the throne they actually were. Kelly converted formally ahead of the wedding, received into the Church of England specifically to preserve Phillips's own position in the succession, a position that, as an untitled grandchild of the reigning monarch, was largely symbolic in any practical sense, but still carried enough genuine constitutional weight on paper to require the formal conversion regardless. The Privy Council formally approved the marriage in April of 2008, exactly as required under the terms of the Separate Royal Marriages Act of 1772. The wedding itself took place on the 17th of May 2008 at St. George's Chapel within Windsor Castle, the very same venue where Prince Harry and Meghan Markle would go on to marry a decade later. It was, by any reasonable measure available at the time, a genuinely significant royal occasion in its own right. Phillips was the Queen's own eldest grandchild, and this represented the very first wedding among any of her eventual 8 grandchildren. The Queen herself attended in person. Prince Philip attended alongside her. Prince Harry attended as well, bringing along his then-girlfriend Chelsea Davy, who the Queen was reportedly meeting for the very first time at this specific event. The guest list, in other words, represented a genuine cross-section of the entire working royal family, all gathered together for what everyone involved fully understood, going in, to be a private family celebration rather than any kind of staged media event. What nobody else in the family apparently understood, until it was already far too late to intervene or stop it, was that Phillips and Kelly had separately and privately arranged to sell exclusive access to that same supposedly private celebration directly to Hello magazine, for a reported total figure of £500,000. The resulting magazine spread ran to a full 100 pages. It included a large number of candid, entirely off-guard photographs taken from inside the actual wedding reception at Frogmore House. Senior members of the royal family laughing together, visibly relaxed, caught in exactly the kind of unposed, unguarded moments that royal press management exists specifically to prevent from ever reaching print in the first place. One particular image from the set, widely reproduced afterward across numerous other publications, showed Prince Harry kissing his own grandmother affectionately on the cheek. According to detailed reporting from the Daily Telegraph and later accounts collected separately by the Daily Mail, the Queen and other senior royals present that day had genuinely been unaware that 4 separate photographers and a reporter were quietly present on the ground at what they had understood, going into the event, that could be a strictly private family occasion, closed to any press. The fallout that followed was both immediate and, for what had been billed as a private family event, unusually public in nature. Buckingham Palace released a formal written statement describing Peter's decision as a serious error of judgment, language that stood out precisely because it was so unusually direct for an institution that typically avoids any public criticism of its own family members. A sitting Labour MP, Ian Gibson, went even further in remarks given directly to the press at the time, drawing a specific and fairly pointed comparison. The British public would expect the Queen to rise above being pictured in the pages of "Hello, she is the Queen, not a footballer's wife." Prince William, according to multiple accounts published from the period, was reportedly especially unhappy about the entire situation, in part because Kate Middleton, who was dating him at the time, but was not yet formally a member of the royal family in any capacity, had been photographed extensively at the event, with no prior understanding whatsoever that those specific photographs might eventually end up published commercially for profit. The palace's institutional response went considerably further than issuing a single public statement of disapproval. According to detailed reporting from the Daily Telegraph published shortly afterward, the Queen personally moved to formally restrict all senior royals from entering into similar magazine photo deals going forward, a policy that multiple outlets have since confirmed has remained firmly in effect for essentially every major royal wedding held from that point onward. In very practical, concrete terms, Peter Phillips's personal decision to monetize his own wedding photographs became the direct, traceable cause of an entirely new and genuinely lasting institutional rule governing exactly how every subsequent royal family event would be managed with the press going forward. There's a specific irony worth pausing on directly here, because it connects back quite precisely to the decision covered in detail in the previous part of this documentary. Anne had spent decades carefully building a version of royal life for her own children that deliberately traded away institutional status in exchange for genuine personal freedom, including the freedom to earn money through entirely ordinary commercial work, without triggering the same kind of public backlash a formerly titled royal would inevitably face for doing the exact same thing. Selling wedding photographs to a celebrity magazine was, in one fairly narrow sense, exactly that same freedom, operating precisely as it had originally been designed to. An untitled royal grandchild, treating his own wedding day as a personal asset he was fully entitled to monetize. In much the same way, he might license his own name to any other commercial brand. The underlying problem, though, was that a wedding is never really an ordinary commercial transaction in the first place. It was also, whatever Peter Phillips's technical legal right to profit from it may genuinely have been, an event his own grandmother, the reigning Queen of England, had personally attended as an entirely unwitting participant in what became, retroactively and without her knowledge or consent, a paid media production. The freedom Anne had so carefully built for her children turned out to carry a genuinely sharp edge to it, one that Peter Phillips found almost immediately in the very first major public appearance of his adult life. Kelly and Phillips went on, following the wedding itself, to live for a period in Hong Kong, where Phillips took on a professional role with the Royal Bank of Scotland, overseeing the bank's sports sponsorship activities across the wider region, before the couple eventually returned to the United Kingdom permanently in 2010. Their first daughter, Savannah, was born later that same year at Gloucestershire Royal Hospital, becoming the Queen's very first great-grandchild, a genuinely significant milestone that generated its own separate round of press coverage, largely free of any of the controversy that had marked the wedding 2 years earlier. A second daughter, Isla, followed in 2012, born at the same hospital. For a period of roughly a decade following the initial wedding scandal, the couple's overall public profile settled comfortably into exactly the kind of low-key normalcy that Anne's original decision about withholding titles had specifically been designed to produce in the first place. 2 young children being raised quietly in Gloucestershire, a working father, occasional appearances at official royal events, and remarkably little sustained tabloid interest beyond the standard, fairly low-level royal-adjacent coverage that tends to follow any sufficiently recognizable family name. That extended period of relative quiet finally came to an end in early 2020, within just a few weeks of a separate and considerably larger news cycle that briefly overshadowed it entirely. The formal announcement, in January of that same year, that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle intended to step back permanently from their official royal duties and relocate first to Canada. In the middle of that considerably larger and more consequential story, Peter Phillips and Autumn Kelly quietly confirmed that they too had separated, having actually done so privately the previous year, and were now proceeding formally toward divorce. In January of 2020, in the weeks before Peter Phillips and Autumn Kelly would confirm their separation to the public, a very different and considerably stranger kind of story about Peter Phillips began quietly circulating in the British press. Someone had found a Chinese television commercial for milk, broadcast to audiences across mainland China, in which the Queen's own eldest grandson appeared directly on camera, holding a glass, delivering the simple line, "This is what I drink," while an on-screen caption identified him plainly and explicitly as British royal family member Peter Phillips. There was no ambiguity anywhere in the framing of the advert itself. This wasn't some background cameo or an old photograph licensed for use without his knowledge or involvement. It was a fully produced advertisement, built specifically and deliberately around his royal connection, running in a market where that particular connection carries genuine, measurable commercial weight, since British and European dairy products are marketed heavily across China as premium, trustworthy goods, precisely because of the associations they carry with institutions like the monarchy itself. Phillips was not simply, in this advert, a man who happened to drink milk in his personal life. He was cast, quite deliberately, as a walking symbol of royal endorsement for an entire product category where that specific kind of endorsement translates directly and measurably into actual sales figures. The reaction within the British press ranged from mildly bemused to faintly embarrassed on the wider royal family's behalf. Outlets covering the story at the time tended to frame it less as a genuine scandal in the conventional sense, and considerably more as a kind of accidental comedy, an oddly literal answer to the underlying question of what an untitled royal grandchild, receiving no state funding whatsoever, is actually still permitted to do in order to make a living for himself. And in the narrowest possible legal sense, the honest answer turned out to be exactly this, because Phillips holds no formal title and receives absolutely no money from the sovereign grant. He falls under none of the informal institutional constraints that would otherwise make a working member of the royal family accepting foreign commercial endorsement money entirely unthinkable. The Daily Mail, reporting on the story at the time it first broke, specifically noted that he receives no royal family funding of any kind whatsoever, explicitly framing the milk advert as a fairly direct and predictable consequence of that particular financial arrangement, rather than treating it as some sudden, isolated lapse in personal judgment. It's worth pausing here on exactly what the Chinese market actually values in this kind of endorsement, because it explains why a minor, untitled British royal was worth signing for a dairy campaign in the first place. Western royal families carry a specific kind of brand equity in China that has almost nothing to do with British domestic politics, and everything to do with imported ideas of heritage, quality control, and old-world trustworthiness. The same broad appeal that has made British boarding schools, Scotch whisky, and European luxury goods reliable sellers to a rising Chinese middle class for decades. A recognizable royal face, even a minor one nobody in Britain could name off the street, reads in that specific market as an implicit quality guarantee. Phillips wasn't hired because Chinese consumers knew who Peter Phillips was. He was hired because the caption under his face did the actual work, turning an ordinary glass of milk into something adjacent, however loosely, to the same institution that still produces coronations covered by global television. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. That specific framing lines up almost exactly with the reasoning laid out earlier in this documentary, back when Anne first made her original decision to withhold titles from both of her children entirely. The trade she made on their behalf, all those decades earlier, was concrete and fairly stark once you trace its full consequences. No institutional status, no sovereign grant funding of any kind, no formal constitutional role whatsoever, in direct exchange for the genuine freedom to go out and build entirely ordinary working lives of their own. A milk commercial in China is, in a real sense, that exact freedom operating precisely as it was originally designed to. It is also, quite undeniably, one of the genuinely stranger public artifacts this entire family has ever produced across 5 decades of documented history, and it captures something true and specific about the peculiar economic position untitled royals actually occupy in the wider world. Close enough to the monarchy itself to have real commercial value attached to their own name, yet far enough removed from it, legally and financially, to be entirely free to cash that value in wherever the open market happens to allow it. It's worth placing this specific advert directly into its immediate surrounding context, because the exact timing here genuinely matters. The commercial itself first surfaced publicly in January of 2020. Within a matter of weeks after that, Phillips and Kelly confirmed that their marriage had formally ended, having actually separated quietly the previous year already. And in that same general window of time, the far larger and more consequential story of Harry and Meghan's departure from official royal duties was actively consuming the vast majority of available media attention focused on the wider family. A royal commentator, writing for the New Zealand Herald shortly afterward, laid out the full sequence of events fairly plainly. In January, cringeworthy ads starring Peter plugging British milk for the Chinese market emerged, and then just weeks later, the end of his 12-year marriage was announced. That same piece went on to note that, in roughly the same general period, David and Serena Armstrong-Jones, Princess Margaret's own son and daughter-in-law, had also separately announced their own marital separation, coming 26 years into their own marriage. 3 entirely separate stories, all breaking within a fairly short overall span of time, prompted that same writer to joke, somewhat memorably, that the palace might soon need someone in to fix the feng shui. None of this, taken individually, ever reached the level of genuine institutional crisis that the Harry and Meghan story clearly did at the time. But it added up, cumulatively, across multiple separate stories breaking in close succession, to a specific and genuinely recognizable pattern that this documentary has now traced carefully across 3 entirely separate generations of the same family. A family that keeps generating small, individually survivable embarrassments at a frequency high enough that royal commentators had, by 2020, already started treating another Phillips story as something close to its own recognizable genre within the wider landscape of royal coverage, rather than experiencing genuine surprise each fresh time it happened again. There's a broader pattern worth naming here too, because Peter Phillips was far from the only member of an extended royal family anywhere in the world to end up fronting a foreign commercial campaign once their own family's formal support had thinned out. Minor royals across Europe have quietly done comparable work for decades. Distant Danish and Swedish royal relatives lending their names to regional tourism campaigns, members of deposed continental royal houses appearing in fashion and jewelry advertising precisely because their titles still carry weight even after their thrones no longer exist. What made the milk advert land differently in the British press wasn't the underlying arrangement itself, which is a fairly ordinary economic reality for minor royalty everywhere. It was the specific gap between the image being sold, a wholesome, trustworthy face of British royal life, and the image most British viewers actually associated with Peter Phillips at that exact moment. A man who, 12 years earlier, had already been formally rebuked by his own grandmother for selling his own wedding photographs. The advert wasn't shocking because it was unprecedented. It was almost funny because it was so completely on brand. The divorce that followed the milk advert by only a matter of weeks was, on its own separate merits, a considerably more significant milestone than the commercial itself had been, for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with tabloid embarrassment and everything to do with genuine royal precedent. Peter Phillips would go on to become the very first of the Queen's eventual 8 grandchildren to divorce, breaking a clean, unbroken record that had held steady across an entire generation of the extended family, at a moment when the institution as a whole was already busy absorbing one of the single most consequential departures in its entire modern history. Peter Phillips and Autumn Kelly formally confirmed their separation on the 11th of February 2020 in a short joint statement that used the specific, carefully chosen language both families would keep returning to throughout the entire process. The decision to separate was, in their own words, the best course of action for their 2 children and ongoing friendship. They had, according to that same statement, actually stopped living together as a couple the previous year already, meaning the public announcement itself came roughly 12 months after the marriage had already quietly ended in private, a pattern that, by this point in the documentary, should feel entirely familiar. Nearly every relationship covered across this entire story so far has followed this exact same basic shape: private breakdown first, public confirmation only much later, once the widening gap between outward appearance and private reality finally became impossible to sustain any longer. What made this particular divorce genuinely different from every prior scandal covered in this family's history wasn't really its content. There was no third party involved anywhere in the story, no paternity dispute, no stolen letters, no court-ordered legal test required to settle a disputed fact. A source close to the couple, quoted directly by the Sun at the time the news broke, was entirely explicit on this specific point. Certainly none of us think either Peter or Autumn are involved with anyone else. What made this particular split genuinely different was its status as an entirely new precedent within the family. Peter Phillips became the very first of Queen Elizabeth II's 8 grandchildren to divorce, a distinction that several outlets specifically noted at the time broke a clean record that had held firm across the entire generation born to her 4 children up to that point. The actual mechanics of the separation itself were handled with a degree of coordination that stands in genuinely sharp contrast to nearly everything else covered earlier in this documentary. Both families released public statements describing themselves as sad but fully supportive of the decision that had been reached. Custody of the couple's two daughters, Savannah and Isla, then aged 9 and 7 respectively, was arranged to be shared jointly between both parents without apparent dispute. The financial settlement itself took over a full year to formally conclude, finally finalized through the High Court on the 14th of June, 2021, with a joint statement noting simply and calmly that the financial aspects of their divorce have been resolved through agreement, the terms of which have been approved and ordered by the High Court today. No public dispute ever emerged over money. No leaked details about specific settlement figures ever surfaced in the press. Nothing whatsoever resembling the drawn-out, deeply acrimonious process that had defined his own parents' divorce 3 full decades earlier. The specific timing of the announcement placed it directly inside one of the most genuinely turbulent stretches the wider royal family had faced in decades. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex had confirmed, just the previous month, their firm intention to step back entirely from official royal duties and relocate first to Canada and eventually on to the United States, a story that went on to dominate global coverage of the monarchy for months afterward and effectively absorbed the vast majority of press attention that, in a genuinely quieter year, might otherwise have been trained far more heavily on Phillips's own divorce instead. In a strange and somewhat fortunate way, the sheer scale of the Sussex departure ended up largely sparing Peter Phillips from the kind of sustained, intense scrutiny his own father's divorce had generated back in 1992, when there had been no comparably larger royal story available at the time to compete for the exact same headlines. Autumn Kelly, for her own part, has kept a considerably lower public profile since the divorce than Phillips has, choosing not to give interviews or comment publicly on the marriage's ending beyond the joint statements both families released at the time. She has continued raising Savannah and Isla in Gloucestershire, close to the Gatcombe Park estate, where the girls' father, grandmother, and step-grandfather all still live, and by most accounts has maintained an amicable, low-friction co-parenting arrangement with Phillips in the years since. Her own life after the marriage has generated remarkably little tabloid interest, a genuinely notable contrast to how thoroughly her original wedding to Phillips had been covered 13 years earlier, and one more small piece of evidence for the broader argument this documentary keeps returning to. Scandal in this family tends to attach itself to specific decisions, not to specific people, and Kelly, unlike her ex-husband, simply never made the kind of decision that generates a headline. Phillips began an entirely new relationship in 2021 with a woman named Lindsay Wallace, and the couple went on to make their first official public appearance together at the Epsom Derby in June of 2022. That particular relationship ended in 2024, without either party ever giving a public account of why, continuing the pattern of this specific chapter of Phillips's life being handled with considerably more discretion than his earlier marriage had been. He later met Harriet Sperling, an NHS pediatric nurse and freelance writer, at an equestrian event, and by the middle of 2024 had already introduced her personally to King Charles III and Queen Camilla, with the couple making their own public debut together at the Badminton Horse Trials that same May. Sperling herself brought her own daughter from a previous marriage into the relationship, and according to reporting from the BBC, she is a distant relation of Prince Richard, Duke of Gloucester, through her late father Rupert Sanders, giving her a faint, largely coincidental connection to the extended royal family that predates her own relationship with Phillips by generations. Their formal engagement was announced in August of 2025, and they were eventually married on the 6th of June, 2026, in a genuinely private ceremony held at All Saints' Church in Kemble, a small village with a total population of under 1,000 people. Reporting on this second wedding was notably explicit about the deliberate contrast being drawn with the first one. Where the 2008 wedding to Autumn Kelly had generated a £500,000 magazine deal and a formal palace rebuke, this second wedding was, in the words of multiple outlets covering it at the time, deliberately arranged to be low-key, with no indication whatsoever of any similar photo arrangement being made with the press. A spokesperson for the couple released a single, understated statement to the press ahead of the wedding, describing it simply as the marriage of Mr. Peter Phillips, the son of HRH the Princess Royal, and Captain Mark Phillips, to Ms. Harriet Spurling, daughter of the late Mr. Rupert Sanders, and Mrs. Mary Sanders of Gloucestershire. No mention of magazine deals, no mention of exclusive access, just names and a date. That specific contrast is genuinely worth sitting with as its own small but meaningful piece of evidence. Whether through direct instruction quietly passed down from the wider family, genuine personal reflection on exactly what had gone so wrong the first time around, or simply the ordinary maturity that tends to come with age and a second chance at getting something right, Peter Phillips appears to have fully absorbed the specific lesson his 2008 wedding had taught the entire institution around him, that the freedom to profit personally from being an untitled royal has clear, practical limits the moment it involves an event other family members are attending as invited guests rather than as paid employees of the production. Reporting on the guest list for the second wedding confirmed that his own father, Mark Phillips, would be attending, alongside Zara Tyndall and her husband Mike, and that Peter's two daughters from his first marriage, Savannah and Isla, by then teenagers, were expected to play a visible role in the day, having reportedly built a close relationship with their father's new wife well before the wedding itself took place. While Peter's marriage was quietly working its way through its own ending in the early 2020s, his younger sister was living out a version of this exact same underlying story with a noticeably different outcome altogether. Zara had married, built a substantial public profile of her own through genuine elite sporting achievement, and had, by most reasonable measures available, largely avoided the kind of sustained scandal that had touched nearly every other member of this extended family across 3 separate generations. That specific difference is not remotely incidental to this documentary's overall argument. It's the clearest available answer to the underlying question this entire story keeps circling back to. Given the exact same starting conditions, the same absence of a title, and the same complicated family history sitting 1 generation back, what does it actually take to come out the other side of all of it, without becoming a cautionary tale told at someone else's expense? Zara Phillips was born in 1981, 4 years after her brother Peter, and grew up inside the exact same underlying arrangement he did, the Queen's granddaughter, carrying no title of any kind, raised at Gatcombe Park by a mother who had deliberately built that entire arrangement specifically to keep both her children out of the institutional machinery that comes bundled together with a princess's actual name. Where Peter's adult life became, over time, a genuine study in exactly how many different ways an untitled royal could still generate public embarrassment despite his relative freedom, Zara's became something considerably closer to a working demonstration of what that exact same starting position looks like when it's handled with noticeably more personal discipline. She inherited her parents' shared obsession with eventing directly, and pursued it with a seriousness that went well beyond simple hobby-level competition into genuinely elite territory. By 2006, she had already become both European and world champion in the sport, and in 2012, competing for Team GB at the London Olympics, she won a silver medal as part of the British eventing team, on home soil, in front of a crowd that included her own grandmother, the Queen, watching from the stands. It was, by any objective measure, a genuinely elite athletic achievement, earned through the same kind of grinding, years-long competitive process her own father had gone through decades earlier to win his own gold medal at Munich, and it gave Zara something almost nobody else covered anywhere in this documentary has ever had genuinely available to them. A public identity built entirely on personal accomplishment that had nothing whatsoever to do with simply being born into this particular family in the first place. That specific distinction matters considerably more than it might initially seem to on the surface. Peter Phillips's most significant public moments, across nearly every part of this documentary covered so far, have overwhelmingly been things that happened to him or around him, rather than things he actively achieved himself. A wedding photo deal, negotiated as much by other parties as by himself, a milk advert that existed specifically because of his royal name, rather than any particular skill or talent of his own, a divorce that broke a family record entirely outside his own control. Zara's single most significant public moment, by clear contrast, was an Olympic medal she won through genuine direct competition against the very best riders in the entire world. in a sport where her royal connection provided essentially zero practical advantage whatsoever once she was actually mounted on a horse in front of Olympic judges, scoring her performance on its own merits. Her personal life followed a broadly similar and considerably steadier path over the years. She began a relationship with Mike Tindall, an England rugby international who had been part of the national squad that won the 2003 Rugby World Cup, and the two were married in 2011 in a public ceremony held in Edinburgh that drew far less controversy overall than either of her brother's two separate weddings would go on to generate. Tindall, much like Zara herself, arrived into the extended family carrying a public profile built entirely on his own individual athletic career rather than any prior connection to royalty whatsoever, and the marriage itself has, in the years since, generated essentially none of the paternity disputes, stolen personal letters, or bodyguard affairs that mark nearly every other significant relationship covered throughout this documentary. The couple went on to have 3 children together: Mia, born in 2014, Lena, born in 2018, and Lucas, born in March of 2021. All of them, like Zara and Peter before them, growing up with no royal titles attached to their names at all, continuing the exact same underlying arrangement their grandmother had originally negotiated back in the 1970s into an entirely new third generation of the family. Lucas's actual arrival, as it turned out, was considerably more dramatic than any birth announcement let on at the time. Mike Tindall later described the delivery in detail on his own podcast, explaining that it happened so quickly the couple never made it to the hospital at all. Lucas was rapid, Tindall recalled. As we got our stuff to go to hospital, she got out of the bath. She could barely stand. She was shaking. The midwife was like, "She's not making the hospital." The birth ended up happening on the bathroom floor of their own home on the Gatcombe estate, with towels and a gym mat pulled in at the last minute, a detail Tindall has since retold on multiple podcasts and interviews, with a mixture of pride and genuine disbelief at how close it came to going wrong. None of this is meant to suggest that Zara's adult life has somehow been entirely free of the ordinary difficulties that inevitably come with being a public figure whose life gets reported on continuously across 2 full decades. Between the births of her children, she experienced 2 separate miscarriages, and rather than let those experiences circulate secondhand through anonymous sources, the way so much of this family's history has traditionally come to light, she has chosen, on more than one occasion, to describe them directly in her own words. In a 2018 interview with the Sunday Times, she described the first loss plainly. "In our case, it was something that was really rare. It was nature saying, 'This one's not right.' I had to go through having the baby because it was so far along." She went on to describe a second, earlier miscarriage in the same interview, and spoke candidly about what it meant to grieve a pregnancy loss with essentially no privacy at all. In a separate interview with BBC Breakfast the same year, she put the difficulty in blunt terms. "I think that's the hardest thing in our situation, is that everyone knew." She added, fighting back tears as she said it, "And very much when things like that happen, normally it's just your family and friends, but unfortunately, everyone knew about it." That specific admission is worth sitting with directly, because it captures something this documentary has circled around from its very first part, without ever naming quite this plainly. Being Untitled brought Zara freedom from constant press scrutiny in most areas of her life. It did not buy her freedom from scrutiny during the one experience where privacy would have mattered most. A royal pregnancy, announced formally through a spokesperson as protocol requires, cannot then quietly become a private loss the way it would for almost anyone else. Zara's own account of that specific gap between the family's general privacy and the total absence of privacy around pregnancy specifically is one of the more genuinely honest pieces of testimony anyone in this entire extended family has given about what the arrangement Anne built back in the 1970s actually does and does not protect against. Where Mark Phillips spent literal decades trying to actively manage the very existence of a child entirely out of public view, and where Anne and Phillips's own marital breakdown played out for years through a steady stream of tabloid-sourced allegations that neither party ever confirmed directly themselves, Zara's general approach to her own hardest personal experiences has consistently been to address them directly on her own terms, in her own words, whenever she personally chose to do so, rather than allow the story to be told by someone else first. Tyndall himself went on to become a minor public figure in his own right, well beyond his original rugby career, largely through an entirely different mechanism than anything else covered so far anywhere in this documentary: reality television and general media appearances, including a widely watched stint on the British jungle survival show I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, in 2022, which introduced him to an entirely new audience, with no particular prior interest whatsoever in ordinary royal family news. During his time on the show, Zara made a surprise appearance to see him, and the two shared a moment that circulated widely afterward, as one of the more genuinely warm, unscripted pieces of footage either of them has ever produced for public consumption. That specific kind of crossover fame, built primarily on personality and self-deprecating humor rather than on any direct royal connection, has, if anything, worked genuinely in the family's favor overall, giving the wider public a version of someone who married into the royals that reads as approachable and down-to-earth rather than embarrassing or scandalous. Taken together, Zara and Mike Tyndall represent something reasonably close to a genuine control group for the entire argument this documentary has been carefully building across its previous 8 parts. Same fundamental absence of a title, same complicated family history of scandal sitting just one generation back, same underlying commercial freedoms and same absence of sovereign grant funding that had made her own brother's milk advert possible in the first place. And yet the actual outcome, across roughly 15 years of adult life spent living in the public eye, looks almost nothing whatsoever like her father's, her brother's, or her own grandfather's generation before that. The difference here isn't the underlying system Anne originally built for her children. Both siblings were given the exact same structural freedom to work with from the very start. The real difference lies entirely in what each of them individually chose to do with that freedom once they had it. By the time his own children had grown into the fully formed adults covered across the last several parts of this documentary, Mark Phillips himself had settled comfortably into a version of old age that looked almost nothing like the young Olympic gold medalist who had married a princess back in 1973. He remained on the Gatcombe Park estate for years after his divorce from Anne, living quietly at Aston Farm, coaching Zara through much of her competitive rise in eventing, and by most surviving accounts maintaining a working relationship with his ex-wife, built primarily around shared parenting logistics and a genuinely shared professional interest in the same demanding sport, rather than around anything resembling actual friendship between the two of them. His second marriage, to the dressage rider Sandy Pfluger, lasted a full 15 years, roughly half the total length of his original marriage to Anne, and it ended in 2012 under circumstances that echoed the earlier pattern almost exactly, right down to the general shape of the story. Reporting from the time described Phillips as having left Pfluger for a considerably younger woman, Lauren Huff, 32 years his junior at the time, a specific detail that made its way into most subsequent coverage of his life whenever his name happened to resurface in connection with his own children's later milestones and family events. It is, by this fairly late point in the overall story, an entirely familiar shape by now, a relationship that had looked genuinely stable from the outside for well over a decade, ending because Phillips had already quietly moved towards someone else long before the public version of events finally managed to catch up with him. What stands out about this specific second divorce, compared directly to the one from Anne 2 decades earlier, is just how little institutional weight it actually carried within the wider royal family. There was no equivalent annus horribilis speech given by the reigning monarch, no formal palace statement was issued, no tabloid frenzy comparable in scale to the original Tonkin paternity story from 3 decades earlier. By 2012, Phillips had spent enough years living entirely outside the formal working structure of the royal family that his personal life had, in a genuinely real and measurable sense, stopped being treated as royal news in quite the same way it once reliably had been. He had become, functionally speaking, exactly what Anne's original decision about withholding titles had ultimately been designed to eventually produce, at least for her own children, a private citizen whose personal choices no longer generated any real constitutional headache for the institution, even in situations where those personal choices were genuinely messy. The relationship with Felicity Wade, the daughter he had originally fathered with Heather Tonkin back in 1985, never substantially changed from the basic pattern first set in the early 1990s. Reporting on the wider family as recently as the past several years continues to consistently describe him as having essentially no real, ongoing relationship with her at all, a detail that stands in sharp and genuinely uncomfortable contrast to the sustained coaching relationship he maintained for years with Zara, and to the carefully coordinated custody arrangements his own son later worked out amicably with Autumn Kelly following their own divorce. Whatever underlying capacity Phillips actually had for functional, ongoing co-parenting over the years, it appears to have applied consistently and exclusively to the children born inside his various marriages, and essentially not at all to the one child who happened to be born outside of one. There's a specific comment, given years after the original scandal, that captures the man's general attitude toward the entire episode better than any of the reporting from 1991 managed to at the time. Asked, decades later, about his relationship with his New Zealand-born daughter, Phillips has consistently declined to engage with the subject in any real detail, and biographers covering the wider family have noted that he appears to regard the entire matter as closed, a private mistake from a specific decade of his life, rather than an ongoing relationship with a living adult woman who happens to share his surname by blood, if not by law. That framing, whatever its psychological comforts for Phillips himself, stands in direct tension with how Felicity herself has described wanting the situation resolved, going all the way back to her mother's original 1991 statement to the press, "Acknowledgment, not silence." He remains, even now, a peripheral but recurring fixture at royal events connected to his own children and grandchildren, photographed occasionally at competitions, weddings, and the kind of extended family gatherings that don't strictly require any formal royal role in order to attend. He was present, according to detailed reporting on the guest list at the time, at Peter's second wedding to Harriet Sperling, back in 2026, standing alongside Anne, Zara, and Mike Tyndall, a small detail that underlines just how thoroughly this entire family eventually settled into the same broad pattern first established decades earlier, a genuinely complicated collection of people whose personal histories toward one another remain difficult at best, choosing ongoing proximity and basic civility over any kind of lasting estrangement, largely because the practical alternative would mean disrupting the far larger, considerably calmer structure everyone else in the family had spent years carefully building around them. Phillips's own public reputation, viewed across the full 50-year arc this documentary has traced, has settled into something quieter than either full redemption or lasting condemnation. He is rarely, if ever, discussed today in the same breath as figures like Prince Andrew, whose scandals produced sustained, formal institutional consequences, the loss of military titles, the loss of royal patronages, an effective removal from public royal life altogether. Phillips lost none of that, largely because he never held any of it to begin with. He was never a working royal, never carried a title the palace could strip, never occupied a constitutional role that a scandal could meaningfully threaten. The very absence of status that this documentary has argued protected his own children also ended up protecting him, the one member of this family whose choices most directly warranted a harsher public reckoning than he ultimately received. There's a specific, slightly uncomfortable honesty worth naming directly here, in wrapping up Mark Phillips's individual portion of this story. He is, by any reasonable reading of the full documented record laid out across this documentary, the single character whose choices generated the most sustained damage. An affair conducted while still married, a child fathered and then actively concealed for 6 years through disguised business payments, an agent willing to threaten the child's own mother into silence on his behalf, and a pattern of leaving successive marriages for younger partners that repeated itself at least twice over the following decades. And yet he was never formally punished by the institution in any meaningful sense beyond being asked to leave one specific house. He kept his access to the extended family. He kept coaching his daughter, He showed up at his son's second wedding decades later, welcomed without apparent objection. The quiet mercy this family extended to Mark Phillips, compared to the sustained public consequences other royal figures have faced for considerably less over the same 50-year period, is itself one of the more revealing details buried inside this entire story. Almost everything covered in this documentary so far has come from the adult record: divorces, affairs, paternity tests, magazine deals. What tends to get lost in that record is the far more ordinary childhood Peter and Zara actually had, underneath all of it, and the sibling relationship that grew out of growing up together on the same 700 acres their entire lives, largely untouched by the scandals swirling around their parents. Peter attended Port Regis Prep School in Shaftesbury before moving on to Gordonston, the same Scottish boarding school that had educated his uncle Charles and grandfather Philip before him, where he was eventually chosen as head boy. He represented Scotland at rugby union at youth and junior level during the mid-1990s, a detail that rarely comes up in coverage focused on his later commercial misadventures. During his gap year, rather than touring Europe in the manner expected of a young man with his connections, he went to Sydney and took an ordinary job with a sports company called Sports Entertainment Limited, the same firm he would later return to as managing director under its rebranded name, Sel Ook. He also worked briefly for Jackie Stewart's Formula One team during that same period, which is where the racing connections that would eventually lead him to Autumn Kelly at a Grand Prix a decade later actually began. Zara, 4 years younger, grew up as the more boisterous of the two, by every account either sibling has given publicly. Peter himself described her plainly in a 2018 interview with the Sunday Times. "Most little sisters are annoying, and Zara was no exception. She tried to boss me around and tell me what to do." He added that she was always at the center of anything that was happening that was fun and boisterous. Zara's own recollection of the dynamic, given in the same piece, ran the other direction. She described her brother as pretty mischievous, and noted that he would often claim that whatever she did wrong, he would somehow end up blamed for it instead. In 2010, that dynamic played out on camera in miniature when Zara was caught on a televised interview, scolding her brother for swearing on air, a small clip that circulated for years afterward as one of the more genuinely human moments either of them ever produced for public consumption. Both siblings have described a childhood built almost entirely around the same estate their parents' marriage eventually broke down on, doing the same ordinary chores any working farm requires. Peter recalled, in an interview with ITV years later, one specific job handed to the youngest children on the property every year before the estate's own major equestrian event. The water jump was frequently filled with algae and weed, and so before the event started, the younger ones amongst us were sent in our swimming trunks to go and weed the pond. Gatcombe Park hosts the Festival of British Eventing annually, drawing competitors and spectators from across the sport, and the two children who would grow up to become, respectively, a scandal-prone businessman and an Olympic medalist spent their early summers wading through pond weed in their swimsuits to get the course ready for it. "I was on a pony before I could really remember," Peter told ABC News in 2014, a detail that applies just as easily to Zara, and explains in fairly simple terms why eventing became the one thing neither divorce, nor affair, nor paternity scandal ever managed to interrupt in this family. Both of them, as adults, chose to raise their own children on the exact same estate rather than move away from a place that had witnessed nearly every scandal covered in this documentary. Gatcombe today includes what the family reportedly calls the party barn, a converted gathering space used for movie screenings and social events, and by Peter's own account, his 2 daughters and Zara's 3 children have grown up with the kind of close cousin relationship that comes from literally living down the same driveway from each other. It is, in its own way, a strange kind of continuity. 3 generations of a genuinely complicated family, choosing, generation after generation, to keep raising their children in the exact same fields where their own parents' marriages first came apart. There's a small, almost bureaucratic detail worth closing this part on, because it captures just how far this family has actually drifted from the center of royal relevance since Peter was born. At his birth in 1977, Peter Phillips stood 5th in line to the British throne, a position that would have made him a genuinely significant figure in any dynastic calculation of the era. By 2026, following the births of Prince William's and Prince Harry's own children, that same position had fallen to 19th. Zara's own position has fallen even further down the list over the same period. Neither sibling seems to have experienced that slide as any kind of loss. If anything, based on everything else covered in this documentary, it looks a great deal like exactly the outcome their mother was quietly engineering for them from the very beginning. Every family this documentary has covered so far has drawn a hard line somewhere between who gets folded into the fold and who gets quietly left outside it. Nowhere is that line drawn more starkly than between Mark Phillips's two daughters born outside his marriage to Anne, Felicity, conceived during the affair with Heather Tonkin in the mid-1980s, and Stephanie, born in 1997, to his second wife, Sandy Pfluger. Same father, two entirely different outcomes. Sandy Pfluger was, like nearly every serious relationship in Mark Phillips's life, a competitive equestrian, born in Hawaii, who represented the United States on its dressage team at the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. She and Phillips married in 1997 in a ceremony in Gloucestershire, covered by Tatler and attended by more than 300 guests, considerably smaller than his wedding to Anne, but still, by any ordinary standard, a genuinely grand affair. Stephanie was born later that same year, their only child together, meaning she has no full siblings of her own, only two half-siblings from her father's first marriage, and one, Felicity, from the affair that had ended his marriage in the first place. What happened to Stephanie afterward stands in almost complete contrast to what happened to Felicity. She grew up partly in a cottage on Anne's own Gatcombe Park estate, the same property her father had once been asked to leave following the divorce, close enough to Peter and Zara that a genuine sibling relationship formed across the age gap of roughly 20 years, separating her from her eldest half-brother. She was a flower girl at both Peter's wedding to Autumn Kelly in 2008 and, years later, had Peter's and Zara's own children serve in her own bridal party when she married a man named William Hosier at St. Mary the Virgin Church in Tetbury in 2022. Princess Anne herself, the woman whose marriage had ended specifically because of the affair that produced Felicity, attended Stephanie's wedding to support her. So did Zara, Mike Tyndall, and Peter, along with his ex-wife Autumn and his then-girlfriend Lindsay Wallace, the full extended and thoroughly blended family, turning out for a half-sister nobody had any formal obligation to embrace. Stephanie herself has spoken publicly, in the small handful of interviews and social media posts collected by royal outlets over the years, about how close that relationship actually became. She described Peter, on one occasion, as the best big brother out there. When Peter and Autumn's youngest daughter Isla was photographed wearing Easter Bunny ears as a toddler, Stephanie posted the photo captioned, "Cutest Easter Bunny ever," and Peter and Autumn replied directly underneath it, "She loves her Auntie Steph." Photographs collected from family events show her giving the considerably larger Mike Tyndall a piggyback ride, and hugging Zara, 17 years her senior, with the easy physical familiarity of two people who genuinely grew up as sisters, rather than distant relations, meeting occasionally at holidays. Stephanie's own adult life has followed a trajectory recognizably similar to Zara's rather than to Peter's. Quiet, largely scandal-free, built around the same equestrian world that has defined nearly every relationship covered in this documentary. She attended Dean Close School in Cheltenham before studying business management at the University of Worcester, worked as a barmaid at one point despite her family connections, and has built a modest career as an event rider sponsored by the saddle maker Voltaire Design, without ever quite reaching the elite level her half-sister achieved at the Olympics. Her father, notably, has spent years working as a cross-country course designer for equestrian events, meaning Stephanie grew up with a parent professionally embedded in the exact sport that defines her own adult identity, in sharp contrast to Felicity, who built her equestrian-adjacent career as a veterinarian entirely without her father's involvement or support. The contrast between the two half-sisters isn't really about talent, or personality, or anything either woman actually did to earn her place in the family, or her exclusion from it. Felicity was born from a concealed affair Phillips spent 6 years trying to hide through disguised payments. Stephanie was born inside a public, Tatler-covered second marriage. Felicity's mother had to go to the press and force a court-ordered paternity test before Phillips would even admit she existed. Stephanie's mother was already, by definition, his wife. The two women share half their genetics and an identical claim, in the strictly biological sense, to being Mark Phillips's daughter. Only one of them got invited to be a bridesmaid at her siblings' weddings. Only one of them got her own half-siblings' children standing in her own bridal party 25 years later. The difference was never really about the children at all. It was entirely about the circumstances of their births, decided by their father's own choices years before either of them had any say in the matter, and it is Stephanie, not Felicity, who has spent her adult life on the inside of a family her father spent decades keeping one of his own daughters carefully outside of. There is a single, recurring image that captures the entire argument this documentary has been building, more efficiently than any of the scandals covered so far. The Buckingham Palace balcony, on Trooping the Colour, every June, for the past 5 decades. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis wave from it every year, dutifully photographed for the front pages. Peter Phillips and Zara Tyndall have, for most of their adult lives, simply never been up there at all. In 2022, in her final years on the throne, Queen Elizabeth II formally restricted the balcony appearance to working members of the royal family only, a policy her son Charles has largely maintained since. Under that rule, cousins like Peter and Zara watch the same event from the Major General's office instead, a genuinely respectable vantage point, but a visibly different one, with none of the same photographic exposure or symbolic weight. What gets reported far less often is that this formal 2022 restriction was, for Anne's own children specifically, not really new at all. According to reporting collected by Hello magazine, Princess Anne reportedly enforced an almost identical rule with Zara and Peter on that same balcony when they were still children themselves, decades before the Queen ever made it official policy for the wider family. The mother who negotiated no titles for her children at birth was, by multiple accounts, also quietly keeping them off the most photographed piece of real estate in the entire monarchy, long before anyone else in the family had formalized that same instinct into an actual rule. That detail reframes almost everything else covered in this documentary. Anne's decision wasn't a single choice made once, in the 1970s, and then left to run on its own for 50 years. It was an ongoing, actively maintained practice, applied consistently across her children's entire childhoods and adult lives, on the one stage in the entire institution built specifically to manufacture the kind of intense, sustained public recognition she had apparently decided her own children didn't need. The pattern holds at the family's other major set-piece events. When Peter Phillips married Harriet Sperling in June of 2026, the couple deliberately skipped the balcony appearance at that year's Trooping the Colour, held only days after their wedding, choosing instead to make their public debut as a married couple quietly at Royal Ascot, rather than on the palace balcony, where a titled royal couple would have been all but expected to appear. Zara herself missed that same Trooping the Colour entirely, despite having joined her mother on the balcony in previous years before the 2022 restriction took hold, an absence Hello magazine noted without much comment, treating it as entirely unremarkable for a royal who was never fully inside the ceremonial structure to begin with. Mike Tyndall, for his part, has reportedly never once appeared at Trooping the Colour in all the years he's been married into the family, a detail that would be unthinkable for the husband of a titled princess, and is treated as a complete non-story for the husband of an untitled one. Zara's own honours, where they exist, have consistently come through the route this documentary has already spent several parts establishing as her signature path. Earned achievement, rather than birthright. She received an MBE in 2007, specifically for services to equestrianism, following her performance on the international eventing circuit, rather than as a ceremonial gift tied to her position in the family. It is a genuinely different kind of recognition than a courtesy title conferred at birth, awarded by the same honours system that recognizes teachers, charity workers, and Olympic athletes with no royal connection whatsoever, for the specific and verifiable reason that she had actually done something to earn it. Her own 3 children carry names that read, on paper, like an ordinary British family, rather than an extension of the House of Windsor. Mia Grace Tyndall, Lena Elizabeth Tyndall, and Lucas Philip Tyndall, all bearing their father's surname rather than any royal styling, continuing the exact arrangement their grandmother built in the 1970s into a fourth generation, now genuinely 2 full steps removed from any real prospect of the throne. At Royal Ascot in June of 2026, days after her brother's second wedding, Zara was photographed sharing what reporting described as a brief moment of affection with King Charles III, a small, warm gesture between an uncle and a niece who occupy completely different tiers of the same family's formal structure, captured by the same royal photography apparatus that, on a different day at a different event, simply wouldn't have had a reason to point its cameras at her at all. That contrast between the cousin who gets photographed warmly at a horse race and the cousin who never appears on the one balcony that defines royal visibility in the popular imagination is really the entire argument of this documentary, rendered as a single recurring photograph, repeated every summer for 50 years. Anne built her children a version of royal life, deliberately excluded from its most visible stage. Whatever chaos individual members of this family have generated across the decades this documentary has covered, none of it has ever happened up there, on that balcony, in front of the cameras built specifically to capture exactly that kind of moment. It has all happened everywhere else, in New Zealand, in Hong Kong, in a Chinese television studio, in a stolen letter, on a public London street. The balcony, for this family, was never really the point. It was, in its own quiet way, the one place Anne made absolutely certain her children would never have to be. Every scandal, every quiet arrangement, every carefully withheld title covered across this documentary traces back to one person's specific choices, and it's worth spending a full part on who that person actually is, stripped of her role as the mother in someone else's story and looked at directly on her own record. Anne was born third in line to the throne on the 15th of August 1950 at Clarence House, and by the time this documentary catches up to the present day, that position has fallen to 18th. She left Benenden School in 1968 with 6 O-levels and 2 A-levels, began undertaking royal engagements the following year at 18, and has, by any measure available, simply never stopped since. She has completed more than 20,000 official engagements since 1968. In 2018, she logged more working days than any other royal, 180 of them, encompassing 518 separate engagements, more than double what Prince William managed that same year, and nearly 6 times what Prince Harry did. As recently as 2025, at the age of 75, she completed 478 engagements across 186 working days, finishing second only to her own brother, King Charles, who kept the pace himself while undergoing active cancer treatment. Asked directly whether she planned to slow down, her answer was characteristically blunt. "I don't think there's a retirement program on this particular life. It really isn't written in." A Canadian secretary to the Queen once summarized her entire operating philosophy in 5 words. Her credo is, "Keep me busy." That relentless work ethic sits in genuine tension with everything else covered in this documentary, and the tension is worth naming directly. This is a woman whose own first marriage collapsed under exactly the kind of institutional pressure and isolation that royal duty imposes, who watched her first husband father a child he spent 6 years hiding, who lived through a kidnapping attempt and a stolen letters scandal, and who responded to all of it not by stepping back from royal duty, but by becoming, by a wide margin, the family member who does the most of it. Whatever the institution cost her personally, and this documentary has spent 13 parts documenting exactly what those costs were, she never treated the job itself as the problem. She treated her own marriage, and later her children's titles, as the things that needed adjusting instead. The balcony rule, covered in the previous part, turns out to have been only one half of a specific, 2-part discipline Anne enforced on her own children from a young age, according to an account Peter Phillips himself gave in an ITV documentary marking his mother's 70th birthday in 2020. Standing on the Buckingham Palace balcony as a child, alongside his mother and sister, Peter recalled there being no room whatsoever for ordinary childish behavior once they were in position. The specific instructions Anne gave her children, before stepping out in front of the assembled crowds, were not the kind of thing typically associated with a mother widely reported to want her children living ordinary lives. They were closer to a code of public conduct, delivered by a parent who understood, better than almost anyone else in this family, exactly how unforgiving the cameras pointed at that balcony actually are, and who apparently decided that if her children were going to appear on it at all, even occasionally, they were going to do so exactly on her terms. Her own athletic record, largely overshadowed in general coverage by her children's and by the scandals surrounding her first marriage, is genuinely serious in its own right. She won an individual gold medal at the 1971 European Eventing Championship on her homebred horse Doublet, was named BBC Sports Personality of the Year that same year at 21, won 2 silver medals at the 1975 European Championships, and in 1976 became the first member of the British royal family ever to compete at the Olympic Games, riding for Great Britain in Montreal. She has served on the International Olympic Committee since 1988 and personally accepted the Olympic flame ahead of the 2012 London Games, the same games at which her daughter Zara would go on to win her own silver medal in the same sport, 35 years after Anne herself had first made history in it. Zara, notably, won the same BBC Sports Personality of the Year award her mother had won in 1971, claiming it in 2006, following her own individual victory at the World Eventing Championships, a rare instance of a specific honor passing directly from one generation of this family to the next, entirely on the strength of athletic achievement rather than birthright. The naming of her own children carries a small but telling piece of family history as well. Peter was born on the 15th of November 1977 at the Lindo wing of St Mary's Hospital in London, becoming the Queen and Prince Philip's first grandchild. Zara arrived on the 15th of May 1981 at the same hospital, and her name, according to Anne's own later account, came directly from her brother Charles. The baby made a rather sudden and positive arrival, Anne explained afterward, and my brother thought Zara, a Greek name meaning bright as the dawn, was an appropriate name. It's a small detail, but a genuinely warm one, and it's worth including precisely because so much of this documentary has necessarily focused on the colder, more calculated dimensions of this family's decisions. Somewhere underneath the title strategy and the balcony rules and the 50 years of scandal, there was also, apparently, a delivery room in 1981, an unexpectedly fast birth, and an uncle reaching for a name that simply felt right for the moment. Anne was present for one further moment that closes out this part of the story on a genuinely different register than anything covered so far. She was with her mother, Queen Elizabeth II, during the final 24 hours of the Queen's life at Balmoral in September of 2022, the only one of the monarch's 4 children able to say so afterward. "I was fortunate to share the last 24 hours of my dearest mother's life," she said in a statement released shortly after the Queen's death. It's a single sentence, offered without embellishment, from a woman who has spent her entire adult life being characteristically blunt in public, and it stands as one of the very few moments in this entire documentary where the record shows Anne speaking not as a strategist managing her family's image, and not as the hardest-working member of a scandal-prone institution, but simply as a daughter. Everything covered across the previous parts of this documentary has focused on the Phillips family's own internal experience of their scandals. What tends to get lost in that focus is how those same events landed on the one person who had to absorb every single one of them simultaneously, in real time, while running a country: Anne's own mother. 1992 did not start as a bad year for the monarchy. It became one in stages, each new development landing before the previous one had settled. In March, Prince Andrew separated from Sarah Ferguson, following the publication of photographs relating to her affair with a Texan oil millionaire named Steve Wyatt. In April, Anne's divorce from Mark Phillips, the one this documentary has spent 3 separate parts documenting in detail, was formally finalized after 18 years of marriage. Through the summer, a newly published, unauthorized biography of Diana, Princess of Wales, laid out in granular detail the unhappiness inside Charles and Diana's own marriage, feeding a tabloid cycle that would culminate, later that year, in the leaked Camillagate and Squidgygate recordings, private phone calls between Charles and Camilla, and between Diana and a separate confidant, both broadcast to the public against either party's wishes. Then, on the 20th of November, a curtain in the Queen's own private chapel at Windsor Castle brushed against a spotlight and caught fire. The blaze burned for 15 hours, destroyed 9 state apartments and more than 100 rooms, and caused what would eventually be assessed at £36.5 million in damage, at a castle first built by William the Conqueror in 1070, and one the Queen herself had lived in for real stretches of her own childhood during the Second World War, when the royal family had the option to evacuate to Canada and chose to stay in England instead. Priceless works of art and furniture were saved only because palace staff, alongside Prince Andrew himself, formed a human chain to carry them out of the burning building by hand. 4 days later, the Queen delivered a speech at Guildhall, marking the 40th anniversary of her accession to the throne, an occasion that would ordinarily have called for a celebratory tone. Instead, in a rare and deliberately understated admission from a monarch famous for saying almost nothing about her own feelings in public, she offered this: 1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis. The correspondent she was quoting, later identified as her own former Assistant Private Secretary Sir Edward Ford, had coined the phrase in a private note to her. She chose to repeat it, publicly, at her own Jubilee celebration, a genuinely unusual act of self-deprecating honesty for an institution built almost entirely around never appearing rattled. What the speech didn't include, and what only surfaced years later through royal biographers with access to former household staff, was how much the year had actually cost her privately, beneath the composed public delivery. Robert Hardman, in his biography Queen of Our Times, records a former member of the royal household describing the Queen as outwardly stoical, as ever, while finding the divorce talks deeply upsetting, adding that every now and then there would be a glimpse of her despair. One specific exchange from that period, recorded by Hardman, captures the toll more directly than anything in the public speech did. A staffer, trying to reassure her that royal divorce was becoming almost ordinary by that point, told her, "Ma'am, it seems to be happening everywhere. This is almost common practice," and Queen's response, delivered with what the staffer described as sheer sadness and exasperation rather than her usual composure, was simply 3 out of 4. 3 of her 4 children's marriages had now collapsed within the same calendar year, and no amount of institutional stoicism fully covered over what that fact actually meant to her as a mother, independent of what it meant to the monarchy as an institution. The public reaction to the Windsor Castle fire added its own separate layer of humiliation on top of the personal one. When Prime Minister John Major suggested shortly afterward that public funds might help cover the restoration costs, the response was immediate and overwhelmingly hostile. Historian Robert Lacey, in his biography Monarch, described it as a popular revolt of astonishing unanimity and power, noting that, while people might feel sorry for the Queen as a person, the misadventures of her children in the previous months had left even her most loyal supporters embarrassed and angry. The backlash was severe enough that the Queen ultimately opened parts of Buckingham Palace to paying visitors for the first time in its history, specifically to help fund the castle's repair privately rather than draw further on public money, already strained by a year of tabloid coverage, documenting exactly how her children's marriages had actually fallen apart. Anne's own divorce sits inside that broader picture as one card in a collapsing hand, rather than as an isolated family drama, and it's worth being precise about what that context does and doesn't change about the story this documentary has already told in detail. It doesn't soften anything about Mark Phillips's own conduct, the 6 years of disguised payments, the threatened silence, the eventual paternity test. What it does add is a fuller sense of the position Anne's own choices, the no-title decision especially, were actually being made from. She wasn't simply managing her own marriage's collapse in isolation. She was watching her entire generation of the family collapse simultaneously, in full public view, in the same 12 months, while her own mother absorbed the entire accumulated weight of it in a single public speech that the world would remember for the phrase, "alone." long after most people had forgotten which specific disasters it had actually been describing. Nearly everything this documentary has assembled about the collapse of Anne and Mark Phillips's marriage has come from outside sources: biographers, tabloid reporting, palace statements, court records. What's been almost entirely absent, deliberately so, is what Peter and Zara themselves have said about living through it, and the handful of times either of them has actually addressed it directly are worth gathering here in one place, because they complicate the picture this documentary has built in a genuinely useful way. When their parents separated in 1989, Peter was 11 and Zara was 8. In a 2018 interview with the Sunday Times, Zara looked back on that period with a specific, deliberate calm that stands in sharp contrast to the tabloid frenzy this documentary has spent several parts documenting around the same events. When my parents separated, it was obviously sad, but the way they did it was not harmful to us, she said. Pressed further on how the divorce actually felt from inside the family rather than from the outside coverage of it, she added, "I don't remember it as a painful time, and I had Pete." The New York Times, reporting at the time of the separation itself, noted that Mark Phillips would move to a nearby farm and retain full access to the children, a detail that lines up with what this documentary has already established about Phillips staying on the Gatcombe estate at Aston Farm, rather than disappearing from his children's daily lives entirely. That specific combination, a marriage that collapsed publicly and acrimoniously enough to generate a paternity scandal, an annus horribilis speech, and 30 years of tabloid retrospectives, alongside 2 children who both describe the actual experience of living through it as something closer to manageable sadness than lasting trauma, is worth sitting with, rather than resolving one way or the other. It's entirely possible both things were true at once: a genuinely painful, complicated adult collapse handled by 2 parents who nonetheless managed, in the specific and narrow area of shielding their children from the worst of it, to do something right. Zara's own account credits her brother directly for that stability. "Pete is someone who I've looked up to all my life," she said in the same interview. "When I was growing up, he was a great person to have around. He was very level-headed, very calm, considered, and grounded. He'll be there, no matter what I need." It's a specific, warm assessment that sits oddly next to the version of Peter this documentary has spent several parts building around the wedding photo scandal and the milk advert. And it's worth remembering that both versions of him are drawn from the same actual person. Timothy Lawrence's own role in the children's lives, once he married their mother in December 1992, gets addressed directly by Peter in the same ITV documentary marking Anne's 70th birthday in 2020, covered earlier in this story. Asked about his mother's marriage, Peter offered a fairly restrained but genuinely warm assessment. They both have an understanding of what being a part of the wider family means and what is required. Of Lawrence specifically, he added simply, "He's been a very strong support for her." Zara's own relationship with her stepfather has been visibly warmer in public settings over the years. At the 2024 badminton horse trials, photographers captured her removing his sun hat and sharing what Hello! Magazine described as a loving embrace in the middle of the competition grounds, a small, unscripted moment between a stepfather and stepdaughter that had nothing to do with any of the institutional machinery this documentary has spent so much time examining. Lawrence himself, notably not a man given to public commentary of any kind, made one of his rare on-record jokes about his own marriage in 2022, observing dryly that it's quite amusing that she married first an army officer and then a naval officer. There's a specific line, given anonymously by a former royal press secretary to The Sun, and quoted in later retrospectives on the family, that captures the entire argument of this documentary about the no-title decision more concisely than anything this documentary has produced on its own, across 16 parts. It was a masterstroke of the Princess Royal when she decided not to give her children titles. Coming from someone who spent their career managing exactly the kind of press attention Anne's decision was designed to deflect, that assessment carries a particular kind of institutional authority. It wasn't just a decision that worked out well in hindsight for 2 specific children. It was recognized, inside the palace's own communications apparatus, as strategically sound at the time, by the very people whose job it was to manage the fallout when royal decisions went badly. Lawrence's presence on the Buckingham Palace balcony during the Queen's Platinum Jubilee celebrations in 2022 is its own small, quietly significant footnote to everything this documentary has covered about that balcony's symbolic weight. He was, according to reporting at the time, the only person of non-royal lineage present on it that day, standing beside a wife who has spent her entire adult life navigating exactly the gap between formal royal status and genuine family belonging that this documentary has traced across 3 generations of her own children and grandchildren. He turned down the earldom that would traditionally have been offered to him on marrying into the family, the same offer Mark Phillips had also declined decades earlier, and built, instead, a quiet decades-long marriage that both of Anne's children now describe, in their own separate ways, as simply a source of stability neither of them takes for granted. On the 6th of May 2023, King Charles III was crowned at Westminster Abbey, in the first coronation Britain had held in 70 years. Every senior working royal had a formally assigned position inside the Abbey, arranged with the same meticulous protocol precision that had governed royal seating charts for centuries. Peter Phillips and Zara Tyndall, along with Zara's husband Mike, attended as guests rather than participants, and the specific way that distinction played out in physical, practical terms turned out to be one of the more genuinely funny footnotes in this entire documentary. Mike Tyndall, never a man who minds saying exactly what he thinks in public, gave his own account of the seating arrangement afterward, and it's worth quoting at length because it captures something this documentary has been circling for 17 parts in a single, blunt complaint. "You're in the hottest spot, but it's happening all around the corner where you can't see," he said. "You do have a front seat, but it was unbelievable being sat there, but frustrating." The seat itself was assigned specifically because of his and Zara's status as non-working members of the royal family, placed prominently enough to be photographed and included, but positioned in a way that meant they could barely follow the actual ceremony taking place a few dozen feet away. It is, almost too perfectly, a physical metaphor for exactly the position this entire documentary has argued Anne built for her children back in the 1970s, close enough to be part of the picture, far enough removed to miss the actual event. Zara herself sits 20th in line to the throne, a position that puts her meaningfully closer to the crown, on paper, than several titled cousins further down the family tree, and yet she has never once represented the royal family on an official engagement in her adult life. Exactly as this documentary has established, across its earlier parts about the no-title arrangement Anne negotiated before either of her children were born. Even had Zara somehow received a formal HRH rank at birth, a detail royal correspondents noted in coverage of the coronation seating dispute, her husband Mike would still never have received royal rank himself by virtue of marrying her, since that specific privilege has historically only flowed one direction, from a male royal to his wife, rather than the reverse. The frustration Mike expressed about his coronation seat, in other words, wasn't really a one-off inconvenience. It was a fairly precise illustration of a structural rule that would have applied to him, regardless of what Zara's own formal title happened to be. The night before the coronation itself produced its own small, telling detail about exactly how differently Peter, Zara, and Mike experienced these occasions, compared to the working royals seated closer to the altar the next morning. According to reporting picked up afterward, Mike and Zara had what was described as a little date night the evening before the ceremony, staying out late into the night around London, wandering past the coronation decorations being installed across the city centre, long after most of the senior working royals had gone to bed, ahead of an exhausting ceremonial day. They were later spotted at the coronation concert the following evening, swaying easily to the music in a way photographs from the event captured as noticeably more relaxed than the composed, upright posture expected of the family members seated in the Abbey's formal sections earlier that same weekend. That single weekend, taken as a whole, might be the cleanest visual summary this documentary has produced of what 50 years of the Phillips family's specific position in the royal family actually looks like in practice. Present at the coronation, because the family connection is real and the institution still wants them there. Seated somewhere that technically counts as prominent, because protocol has to put them somewhere. Unable to actually see the ceremony properly, because the protocol wasn't really built with them in mind. And free, the night before and the night after, to walk around London or dance at a concert in a way no working royal photographed at the same events that weekend could have managed without immediately becoming a headline. Mike Tyndall's own complaint about his sightline inside Westminster Abbey turns out to be a surprisingly precise description of exactly where this entire family has sat, structurally, for the last 5 decades, present, visible, and just slightly out of position to see the thing everyone assumes they're at the center of. 2 moments from Peter Phillips's adult life sit almost directly opposite each other on the spectrum this documentary has spent 17 parts tracing, and neither one has been covered yet. One of the most successful, well-received things he ever organized for the family, and one of the most solemn, private ones he ever took part in. The first is professional. After leaving the Royal Bank of Scotland in March of 2012, where he had spent 7 years helping build the bank's first global Formula One sponsorship program, Phillips teamed up with a longtime friend and mentor, James Erskine, to found Sports and Entertainment UK Limited, known simply as Sel UK, in London that same year. The firm's stated focus was increasing the commercial value of sports and entertainment rights holders across Britain while delivering large-scale events, and its client list, according to the company's own materials, has come to include his own sister, Zara Tyndall, the Magic Millions Festival of British Eventing, City Racing, and the UK's Department for International Trade, among others. It is a genuinely ordinary corporate career by any objective measure, the kind of profile that would attract no attention at all if the managing director's surname weren't Phillips. The clearest demonstration of what that specific combination, ordinary corporate skill plus an extraordinary family name, could actually produce, came in 2016, when Phillips took the lead in organizing the Patrons' Lunch, a street party held along the Mall to mark the Queen's 90th birthday. The event brought together 10,000 guests for a shared picnic down the same processional route this documentary opened its very first part on, the same stretch of road where Ian Ball had once forced his mother's car to a stop in 1974. It was, by most accounts, a logistical success, drawing on exactly the kind of large-scale event management experience Phillips had spent over a decade building at Jaguar, Williams, and RBS. Deployed for once, in service of an occasion nobody could accuse him of monetizing at his family's expense. If the 2008 wedding photo deal was the clearest example of Peter Phillips testing the limits of what his position allowed him to profit from, the Patrons' Lunch is the clearest example of the same skill set turned towards something the family and the public both seem to have genuinely welcomed. The second moment sits at the opposite emotional register entirely. On the 17th of September, 2022, during the period of official mourning for Queen Elizabeth II, Phillips joined his sister Zara and 6 of their cousins to stand a 15-minute vigil around their grandmother's coffin as it lay in state inside Westminster Hall. The image of the Queen's 8 grandchildren standing motionless around the catafalque, heads bowed, in near total silence, became one of the defining photographs of the entire mourning period, reproduced across nearly every major outlet covering the funeral. Unlike almost every other public appearance covered across this documentary, this one carried no scandal, no commercial angle, no institutional rebuke waiting on the other side of it. It was, simply, a grandson and a granddaughter standing guard over the body of the woman whose own decisions, made decades before either of them were born, had shaped almost every choice covered in this entire documentary. The decision to let Anne withhold their titles, the decision to maintain a working relationship with a divorced daughter and her difficult first husband, the decision, quietly made and never once publicly explained, to let 2 of her 8 grandchildren grow up mostly out of the spotlight. The other 6 had lived inside their entire lives. Both moments, the Mall Street party and the Westminster Hall vigil, happened because Peter Phillips was close enough to the institution to be asked to take part in each of them, and neither one would have generated a single headline of complaint the way the wedding photos or the milk advert did. That contrast is worth sitting with directly as this documentary moves toward its own conclusion. The specific freedom Anne built for her children was never really about whether they'd occasionally do something embarrassing with it. Every adult does something embarrassing eventually, titled or not. It was about whether the ordinary, unremarkable, occasionally even genuinely moving things they did with that freedom, organizing a birthday party for 10,000 people, standing silently over a grandmother's coffin, could exist in the public record without automatically becoming a constitutional matter for the entire institution to manage. For most of Peter Phillips's adult life, whatever else can be said about his specific choices, that particular part of Anne's original bet paid off exactly as she seems to have intended it to. In March of 2021, with Britain still under strict national lockdown, Peter Phillips drove roughly 460 miles from his home on the Gatcombe Park estate in Gloucestershire to a small property in St. Cyrus, near Montrose in Aberdeenshire, to see a woman named Lindsay Wallace. Someone reported it to the police. On the evening of the 26th of March, officers attended the property, spoke to the people inside, and confirmed publicly afterward that they had found no actual breach of the coronavirus regulations then in force. A spokesperson for Phillips offered a specific, formal explanation for the trip. Peter Phillips travelled to Scotland on business, in connection with his work for XF Medical, which operates in the COVID testing arena. We do not comment on details or circumstances of Mr. Phillips's accommodation when travelling. The story broke less than a month after Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's Oprah interview had already put the royal family through one of the more difficult stretches of press coverage in its recent history, and it landed inside a broader run of pandemic-era royal missteps this documentary hasn't previously covered. Prince William making a joking remark about the pandemic during a tour of Ireland, Prince Harry publicly criticising the tone of coronavirus media coverage, William keeping his own COVID diagnosis private rather than disclosing it, and William and Kate facing criticism from Scottish and Welsh politicians over a royal train tour conducted during a period of restricted travel. Phillips's own trip became, by some counts, the 8th distinct pandemic-related controversy to touch the extended royal family in roughly a year, though notably one of the few involving a titled royal's cousin, rather than a working member of the family itself. Reporting from The Sun at the time filled in the human context the official statement left out entirely. Phillips, separated from Autumn Kelly since 2019, with the divorce not yet formally announced, had reportedly been quietly seeing Lindsay Wallace, a woman described as married but separated from her own husband, for some time before the Scotland trip made headlines. Peter is besotted with her. They have known each other for quite some time, a source told the paper. This latest trip isn't the first time he has been to Scotland to visit her. They have been keeping things under wraps. Only the inner circle knew about this friendship. Wallace herself was described as coming from a wealthy background, her father having worked in the oil industry, with the family understood to pride itself on its standing as, in one source's description, pillars of their local community. The same reporting noted a small, genuinely warm detail, connecting Wallace directly back to this documentary's earlier chapters. She had attended Gordonston, the same school covered in Part 11, and had reportedly stayed close friends with Zara Tyndall specifically, meaning the woman Peter Phillips would go on to date openly after his divorce was already, in a real sense, part of his sister's own social circle before she ever became part of his. The relationship that the lockdown trip exposed publicly went on to become official within months, with Wallace and Phillips making their first confirmed appearance together as a couple at the Epsom Derby in June of 2022, exactly as this documentary noted in an earlier part. What's genuinely new here is the texture the COVID story adds to that same relationship's beginning. Not a clean, uncomplicated new romance announced on Phillips's own terms, but one that first surfaced publicly through a police report during a national lockdown, filtered through a corporate cover story about COVID testing work, at a moment when the country was watching every member of extended royalty for exactly this kind of rule-bending. There's a smaller, later footnote from the same period worth including here as well, because it shows the same underlying tension, access to royal-adjacent prestige without royal-level protection, playing out again in an entirely different context. In 2023, Phillips was reported to be staging an ice skating attraction at Kensington Palace, called Ice, intended to let members of the public skate on the palace grounds that winter. The event was ultimately postponed, with organizers citing recent world events which have affected safety and security in the area. One commentator, discussing the postponement, offered a fairly precise summary of exactly the position this documentary has spent 19 parts describing. This is someone who does not have an HRH title. He is a private citizen. Yes, he is Princess Anne's son, but he has made his own living and runs an event company. The ICE event, whatever its eventual fate, is one more example of the same basic pattern running underneath nearly everything in Peter Phillips's adult life. A name valuable enough to attach to a commercial venture at one of the most recognizable palaces in the world, and a legal status ordinary enough that when security concerns arose, there was no institutional apparatus standing behind him the way there would have been for an actual working royal running the same event. Every extended family produces one member who becomes, almost by accident, the person best positioned to talk casually and publicly about the family's most sensitive internal dynamics, simply because nobody quite thinks of them as royal enough for their comments to carry real institutional weight. In this family, that person is Mike Tindall, and his own long, occasionally clumsy relationship with the story of Harry and Meghan's departure from royal life is worth examining directly, because it reveals something about how this entire untitled branch of the family actually relates to the more famous scandals happening one tier above them. Tindall's own connection to Harry goes back further than his marriage to Zara. At a party following England's 2003 Rugby World Cup final win, the same tournament this documentary noted earlier as the source of Tindall's own athletic reputation, he and a teammate, Ian Balshaw, jokingly pretended to punch a much younger Prince Harry, a moment that stayed buried as a minor rugby circle anecdote for the better part of 2 decades. It resurfaced in 2024 when Tindall retold the story on a live broadcast of the British television show A Question of Sport, joking that the royal family had wanted to fill him in for real afterward. The joke landed badly online, particularly once the royal commentator Omid Scobie amplified the clip on social media as an example of casual disrespect toward Harry from inside his own extended family. Tindall's co-author on his rugby memoir, James Haskell, later described the backlash plainly. It did come back into public consciousness when Omid Scobie started sticking up for Harry and Meghan, and loads of trolls went in on Mike, especially about him wanting to fill in a young, defenseless Harry. The joke itself, resurrected from a party more than 20 years earlier, is a fairly small thing on its own. What makes it worth including here is what it reveals about Tindall's specific position inside this family's broader story. Close enough to Harry, going back decades, to have genuinely joked around with him as a young man at a celebration neither of their future wives had any part in yet, and distant enough from the formal royal structure that a joke like that could resurface and circulate as pure entertainment gossip, rather than triggering the kind of institutional statement Buckingham Palace issued over Peter Phillips's wedding photos in 2008. When Harry and Meghan's actual departure from royal duties became public in January of 2020, the same month Peter Phillips's milk advert and impending divorce were both quietly working their way toward headlines, Tindall was asked directly for his reaction. His response, given on the House of Rugby podcast, was a study in deliberate, almost comic evasiveness. "Let's not talk about that," followed by, "I don't know anything about it." It's a genuinely revealing non-answer, coming from a man otherwise known across British media for blunt, unfiltered commentary on almost every other topic put in front of him, rugby or otherwise. The one subject he chose to go quiet on, at the exact moment it became publicly relevant, was the one most likely to actually touch the institution his wife's family belonged to. By August of that same year, once Harry and Meghan had settled into their new life in California, Tindall had softened into something closer to genuine, if carefully generic, support. Appearing on Good Morning Britain, he said, "They're busy doing what they're doing, and I just want them to be happy with what they're doing, and be happy with each other," he added, invoking the specific language of family loyalty rather than institutional politics. He's stressed that it's all about his family, so you've got to support him through that. It's a notably different register from the guarded silence of the House of Rugby interview 7 months earlier, and the shift says something about how this specific corner of the family actually processes a genuine institutional crisis once the initial shock has passed. Caution first, while the story is still unfolding and still capable of generating real consequences, followed eventually by a warmer, more personal framing once the dust has settled, and taking a side no longer carries the same risk. Tyndall's own memoir, co-written with Haskell and Alex Payne, leans hard into exactly the kind of ordinary, unguarded family portrait. This documentary has spent several parts building around Peter and Zara's own childhood at Gatcombe. He describes informal moments with Queen Elizabeth II that, in his own telling, contrast sharply with the public image of a rigidly formal monarch, part of a broader pattern this documentary has already traced. Nearly everyone who marries into this specific branch of the family, from Timothy Lawrence to Mike Tyndall himself, ends up describing it as considerably warmer and more relaxed in private than its public reputation suggests. Whether that consistency reflects the actual texture of life at Gatcombe, or simply the specific kind of story every new arrival to this family eventually feels compelled to tell about it, is a question this documentary can't fully settle. What is clear is that the pattern holds, generation after generation, spouse after spouse. Warmth in private, scandal in public, and Mike Tyndall's own halting, evolving commentary on Harry and Meghan sits as one more small data point in exactly that same recurring shape. This documentary opened with the attempted kidnapping on the Mall in 1974 and closed that chapter with the immediate aftermath, the medals, the institutional overhaul of royal protection, the two words Anne said that made her famous for the rest of her life. What it didn't cover was what happened afterward to the two men whose lives intersected with hers for those few violent minutes, and both of their later stories complicate the tidy, heroic version of that night in ways worth returning to directly. Ronnie Russell, the former boxer whose punch to Ian Ball's head finally broke the assault apart, was awarded the George Medal for his actions, one of the two highest British honours available for non-combat bravery. For years afterward, it was widely reported and widely repeated in royal retrospectives that the Queen had personally paid off Russell's mortgage as a private gesture of gratitude for saving her daughter's life. It became one of those small, comforting details that gets folded into the official story precisely because it fits so neatly, the grateful monarch quietly taking care of the ordinary man who stepped in when the professionals couldn't. It wasn't true. Russell himself confirmed as much in 2020, explaining that a police officer had once suggested to him that the mortgage payment might happen, a suggestion he took seriously enough to stop making his own payments in anticipation of it. It never came. Within 4 months, Russell said, he had nearly lost his home entirely, saved only by resuming payments himself once it became clear the rumoured royal gesture wasn't materialising. A man who had physically intervened to stop an armed kidnapping of the sovereign's own daughter and been formally decorated for it by the Crown, spent the following months quietly at risk of losing his house because a story about royal gratitude had outrun the actual, considerably less generous reality. That detail sits uncomfortably next to everything else this documentary has covered about how differently this family's various debts get handled. The Queen personally and repeatedly subsidized her ex-son-in-law's daughter's wedding attendance, her own daughter's overdrawn accounts, and decades of Gatcombe Park's upkeep, largely without complaint, while the myth of a mortgage quietly paid off for the man who may have saved Anne's life circulated for years without anyone actually confirming it, let alone acting on it. Whether that reflects genuine oversight, institutional indifference to someone outside the family circle, or simply the ordinary human tendency for a comforting rumor to substitute for anyone actually checking whether it was true, the gap between the story and the reality is real, and it took Russell decades to correct it publicly himself. Ian Ball's own story took an even stranger turn much later. Diagnosed with schizophrenia after his arrest, he pleaded guilty to attempted murder and kidnapping, and was detained in secure psychiatric hospitals for 45 years in total, finally released in 2019 at close to 70 years old. In 2025, more than 50 years after the shooting, he gave an interview in which he claimed the entire kidnapping attempt had never actually been intended to succeed, describing it instead as a stunt that was always meant to fail. It is, on its face, a difficult claim to reconcile with a typed ransom note demanding millions of pounds, 2 loaded pistols, 2 pairs of handcuffs bought in advance, and 5 separate people who were actually shot over the course of the attack. Whatever credibility that late claim deserves, and this documentary makes no judgment on it either way, it stands as one of the more genuinely strange footnotes in this entire 50-year story. The one person whose actions started everything covered across these 21 parts, spending his final decades trying to reframe, in a single interview, an event the rest of the historical record has never treated as anything other than exactly what it looked like at the time. The attack itself went on to inspire two separate pieces of fiction, a detail rarely mentioned alongside the factual record. Granada Television produced a docudrama about it in 2006, titled To Kidnap a Princess, and elements of the attempted kidnapping found their way, transformed, into the plot of Tom Clancy's novel Patriot Games, which itself became a Harrison Ford film built around a fictional attack on a different royal figure entirely. A single night on the Mall in March of 1974, 4 minutes of gunfire, and one refused kidnapping, ended up seeding a television drama, a best-selling thriller, and a Hollywood film, while the actual man who threw the punch that stopped it nearly lost his house over a rumor nobody bothered to confirm. There's a specific kind of afternoon that recurs at Gatcombe Park every year, and it's worth describing it directly before closing this story out, because it captures something the last 21 parts of Scandal and Reconciliation haven't quite managed to say outright. Every summer, the Festival of British Eventing takes over the same fields where Peter and Zara once waded through algae to clear the water jump as children, where their parents' marriage first began fraying in the late 1970s, and where 3 generations of this family now live within a few hundred yards of each other. Competitors from across the sport arrive, spectators fill the same grounds that hosted a Silver Jubilee garden party and 100 family Christmases, and for a few days each year, the estate does exactly what it was always built to do: host a working equestrian event, unremarkable in any way except for who happens to own the land underneath it. That ordinariness is, in the end, the actual argument of this entire documentary, and it's worth stating it plainly, rather than letting it stay implicit in the accumulated weight of everything covered so far. Princess Anne inherited a fairy tale in 1973 that had already curdled into something considerably harder by the time she filed for divorce 19 years later. A husband whose serial infidelities produced a hidden daughter he spent 6 years disguising as a business expense. A bodyguard affair born from years of quiet isolation inside her own marriage, and a stolen set of love letters that exposed her own second relationship to the public before she'd had any chance to end the first one on her own terms. She survived an assassination attempt 4 months into that marriage, delivered under gunfire what may be the single most quoted sentence in modern royal history, and then spent the following 2 decades absorbing, in near-total public silence, exactly the kind of institutional pressure that her own mother would eventually describe, in a single unguarded moment, to a member of her own household staff, with nothing more elaborate than 3 out of 4. What Anne did with all of that, and this is the through line this documentary has been tracing since its very first part, was make one specific, quietly radical decision before either of her children was even born. She declined the titles that would have made Peter and Zara into princes and princesses in their own right, and in doing so, built the only branch of the modern House of Windsor whose scandals never once became the monarchy's constitutional problem. Mark Phillips fathered a child he spent decades failing to acknowledge, married twice more, left both subsequent partners under circumstances that echoed his first divorce almost exactly, and faced, in the end, no institutional consequence beyond being asked to leave one specific house, because he had never held enough formal status for the institution to need to punish him. Peter Phillips sold his own wedding photographs to a magazine, appeared in a Chinese milk advertisement captioned with his royal connection, and drove 460 miles during a national lockdown to see a woman he was falling for, and each of those episodes generated exactly 1 news cycle's worth of embarrassment before disappearing, because none of them ever touched the actual machinery of the crown. Zara Tindall built an Olympic career, married a rugby player who once pretended to punch her own cousin at a party, endured 2 miscarriages in circumstances she has since described, in her own words, as impossible to grieve privately, precisely because everyone already knew, and came out the other side of all of it with a life that looks, by any reasonable measure, genuinely happy. None of that happened by accident, and none of it happened because this family was somehow less flawed than the titled cousins, whose scandals have dominated far more of the public conversation about the modern monarchy. Mark Phillips's conduct, examined honestly across this documentary's third and fourth parts, was in some respects worse than anything Prince Andrew has been formally accused of in public. The difference was never the severity of what happened. It was the structural position each man occupied when it happened. Andrew's failures became the monarchy's failures, because Andrew was the monarchy, in the specific formal sense that titles and constitutional proximity actually mean something. Phillips's failures stayed his own, because Anne had made sure, years before any of it occurred, that neither he nor his children would ever occupy that same formal position again. That's the real inheritance this family passed down across 3 generations, now covered in this documentary, from Peter and Zara to Zara's own children Mia, Lena and Lucas, growing up on the same estate, under the same arrangement their grandmother negotiated half a century ago. Not privilege in the traditional sense, and not the kind of security that comes from a sovereign grant or a constitutional role. Something closer to structural insulation, the freedom to be genuinely, messily human, to make the same mistakes anyone else's family makes, without those mistakes automatically becoming a matter of state. It's why Peter Phillips's second wedding, in 2026, could be arranged as a quiet, largely private ceremony in a village of under 1,000 people, with no formal palace statement required either way, while his first wedding, in 2008, produced language serious enough that a sitting member of Parliament felt moved to compare the Queen's own conduct unfavourably to that of a footballer's wife. The institution he embarrassed in 2008 wasn't fundamentally different from the one he quietly married into again in 2026. What changed was that Peter Phillips, by then in his late 40s, finally seemed to understand exactly where the edges of his own freedom actually sat, and stopped testing them. Mark Phillips remains, even now, the unresolved figure at the center of this entire story, present at his son's second wedding, welcomed without apparent objection at family gatherings that include the daughter Anne raised without him, and still, after more than 40 years, essentially estranged from the one child whose existence he spent the longest time trying to make disappear. Felicity Wade continues her own life in New Zealand, an equine veterinarian and a mother herself now, carrying her father's surname's biological reality without ever having received what her own mother asked for in 1991. Acknowledgment, offered freely, rather than extracted through a court order. That imbalance, more than any single scandal covered across these 22 parts, is the one piece of this story that has never actually been resolved, and it likely never will be, not because the facts remain in dispute, but because one man, well into his 80s now, appears to have simply decided, decades ago, that the matter was closed. Anne herself, at 75, shows no sign of treating any of it as closed. She remains, by the numbers, one of the 2 or 3 hardest working members of the entire royal family, logging hundreds of engagements a year in a role that comes with no retirement plan and, by her own account, was never expected to have one. She was at her mother's side for the final 24 hours of the Queen's life in September of 2022. She attended her ex-husband's second daughter's wedding in 2022 and her son's second wedding in 2026, standing in the same small crowd as the man whose infidelity had ended her first marriage more than 3 decades earlier, because that, in the end, is simply what this family does. Not forgiveness exactly, and not forgetting, but a kind of practiced, geographically compressed civility that keeps everyone circling the same few hundred acres of Gloucestershire farmland, year after year, regardless of what any of them did to each other along the way. 52 years after Ian Ball forced a maroon limousine to a stop on the Mall, and Princess Anne told him, flatly, that she wasn't going anywhere with him, that same refusal has come to describe something considerably larger than one night of gunfire outside Buckingham Palace. It describes a woman who spent the rest of her adult life refusing, in one deliberate decision after another, to let the institution she was born into dictate every single term of her children's lives, even as it continued, and still continues, to dictate most of the terms of her own. The fairy tale sold to 500 million people at Westminster Abbey in 1973 never really survived the decade that followed it. What survived instead, quieter and considerably less photogenic, was something closer to an actual family, complicated, occasionally embarrassing, genuinely loving, in places nobody expected it to be, and built, deliberately, just far enough outside the spotlight that it was allowed to be all of those things without the entire country watching every single time. That was always the point. It still is. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.